Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. You're all very welcome to the Dora Almond Room here in the Hub, and to our afternoon colloquium, The Reasons of Rhyme. My name is Darragh O'Connell from the Department of Italian, and I also have the dubious honour of being the director for the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland. And the reason why I want to talk about this particular thing, and the banner behind me for blatant use of branding, is the kind of work that the Dante Studies Centre has here in UCC and the kind of activities it's involved in. Now, I'm just going to read you the blurb of what the centre sets out to do, and I'm going to read from our website. So it supports a transdisciplinary culture of collaborative research across the various strands of Dante studies. Now, some of you might be thinking, I'm in the wrong room. The centre is part of and housed in the Department of Italian University College Cork, and it was established in 2020. It responds to a genuine need to have an Irish-based centre which not only fosters world-class research on the figure of Dante and the myriad of related fields to him: medieval studies, modern and contemporary poetry and narrative, music and art, philosophy, theology, and creative practice, but which engages with the wider public in exploring Dante's encyclopedic Divine Comedy, creating a rich dialogue with today on notions centered on citizenship, exile, migration, moral responsibility, conflict resolution, and the polysemous nature of language, and much, much else besides. Now, that's what we have written in our, or at least on our website. One of the great joys of being involved in the centre for me personally over the last number of years is not only do we have a wonderful array of really excellent doctoral candidates working on Dante-related subjects. Almost every year we receive here at UCC postdoctoral fellows from the IRC, and with them they bring their amazing projects and their amazing ideas. I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Valentina Mele, who, when she was co-director of the centre here, and she was with us here physically in UCC, she herself, part of their time here is that they have to do some kind of organize a conference, organize some type of event. And besides a wonderful Cavalcanti conference, she also organized a brilliant Dante dialogue on translating Dante, which brought together not only theorists in and around the ideas of translation, but actual translators, and more importantly still, poet translators, which is a completely different category altogether, and was quite wonderful, bringing the creative practice into it as well. Last year, Aista Kiltana along with Elsina Caponetti, organized a wonderful in visiting the afterlife, Dante and the Irish visionary tradition. That was a wonderful day-long conference on visionary literature in Dante and in the Irish context. So each year we have someone who's doing something a little bit different, and it really is something special. This year, when we asked George what would he like to do, there was a certain amount of fear and trepidation amongst everybody that he'd want to have a one-day conference on the Hapax. Thankfully, George decided that perhaps would not be the best way to go about things, and decided to concentrate on rhyme and to involve here in UCC the wonderful and very rich array of people who are involved in creative writing, creative practice, and to kind of reflect on, mediate, and meditate on notions of rhyme. And that's what we're here for today. It's a very rich program of speakers. And it's so nice to see people from different languages also talking about poetry and rhyme from different eras. And later on, again, we're going to have a number of readings in the common room for our readings. So that's all from me. I'm going to pass over to George now, whose brainchild this is. So can I introduce Dr. George Rayson? George.
Thank you, Darragh, for that lovely introduction. And thank you as well, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. Slightly weird brainchild that's going on here. But it's wonderful to see it come to fruition. And especially, there's lots of people I'd like to thank, first of all. So I'm going to thank a couple of people, and I'm going to explain how today is going to work. I think the microphone this is the level it's going to be. So could we please ask the speakers to use their best dramatic voices, their best projections from drama school, to really hit the back of the room, please. Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Italian department as well for hosting me and hosting the event and hosting so much and for making me feel so welcome and enabling this event to happen. In particular, I'd like to thank Chiara Valcelli, who has done loads of stuff behind the scenes, making all the tech work, also doing all the beautiful posters and the publicity. And so I couldn't really have done any of this without her. Also Leonor de Oliveira, who's the departmental secretary, who does everything with a quiet calm and sanguinity that is just really, you can't really match. And so she's completely invaluable. And finally, he's going to hate it. I really would like to thank Dara. And this is really, I'm going to torture him now by praising him a little bit. It's the worst thing I could possibly do. Because without him, I wouldn't really know what to do and know how anything worked, how to organize anything really. And I don't think he honestly gets enough credit for doing everything so kind of professionally, calmly, and promptly. And I know he'd prefer to just sort of be the spider behind the scenes. Yeah, so. But in fact, I think there should be some limelight on him, even though he would say in the immortal words of Cork native Roy Keane, it is just his job. But he does it with aplomb and distinction. So I'm very, very grateful. So I'd like, yes, that's the thank yous to the Italian department. I'd also like to thank Kazalak for providing the funding as well today, which is great, as well as involvement of the Translation and Creative Practice Research Cluster, with whom I shared this event, and got some excellent support. And most of all, I'd like to thank the speakers, and coming from all over the university, well, all over kind of the creative humanities side of the university, as well as Professor Salvadori Lonergan for coming all the way down from Dublin. Very much appreciate you all for participating. I'm not going to do too much of a spiel now because I think we'd like to all hear what professionals have to say about the matter. But I was drawn to this because from a Dante point of view, from a medieval Italian point of view, I found that everybody sort of ignored rhyme. I also did an undergraduate thesis back in the day on the reception of rhyme in Joyce's Ulysses, based on Dante. And in that research, I found that actually there's remarkably, for how common rhyme is from a Hallmark greeting card to high poetry, there's actually comparatively little written on it. Now, that was about 10 years ago that I did my undergrad dissertation. Things may have changed in the world of contemporary English literary criticism. And this is why I wanted to do this event, because I wanted to find it as a professional curiosity, find out whether this was just my hunch, this was just a straw man that I'd created, or whether it's real. And actually, there is a neglect and a big lacuna in critical thinking about rhyme, and whether this is a productive and a new way to approach poetry, to kind of breathe some fire back into what can seem and has seemed since arguably Milton, certainly in English, in the Anglophone sphere, as a kind of fuddy-duddy kind of limitation on poetic creativity. And I want to challenge that and see what new buds and shoots can emerge. So, thank you very much again for coming. I really appreciate it. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ellen Dillon, our first speaker, who is the UCC writer in residence. Ellen Dillon is a poet and writer of explanatory prose from Limerick, with a PhD on contemporary poetry from the School of English at DCU, and an MA in Italian from UCD. Her most recent books are Fare Thee Well, Miss Carousel, and Tentatives, published with Paminar Press. And other books include Morsel May Sleep, Poems from Mayame's Classroom, and Excavate, Poems After Pasolini. She has received the Agility Award and Literature Bursary from the Arts Council, and is 2025 writer in residence in UCC. Her most recent work of essay, prose poetry, and fiction, A Whale Called Milieu, was shortlisted for the inaugural Prototype Prize for Writers and Artists working at the intersections of different literary and artistic forms. And today, Ellen will be speaking on the topic of You Don't Put a Straitjacket in Order Not to Pick Your Nose, Feats of Rhyme in Contemporary Translation from Irish. Please join me in welcoming Ellen Dillon. Are we sharing the screen, or do I need to do that? And then share it manually. Yeah. Okay. Hang on. Yeah, go on. Entire screen. Yeah.
Yes.
And is that fine now?
Select the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Also it and click yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you everybody. I'm delighted to be here. A little nervous because I'm talking about something that is far outside my wheelhouse, so bear with me. And this paper suffered a last minute change of title. Oops. Okay, suffered a last minute change of title, which I think will make more sense when we get to the end. It's now called Taking Liberties with Saoirse, Straitjackets and Something Else in Sean O'Riordan and Paul Muldoon. Okay, today I'm going to talk about uses of rhyme in two poems. Sean O'Riordan's Irish poem Saoirse and Paul Muldoon's English poem Freedom, that is forward to the Yale University Press selection that constitutes the first introduction to O'Riordan's work for many readers outside the Irish language. Or it will focus on uses of rhyme in the translation of Saoirse from O'Riordan's Irish into Muldoon's English. Any paper on poetry in translation might feel that it must begin by facing down the ghosts of Robert Frost and Dante. Poetry is what gets lost in translation, or nothing harmonized according to the rules of poetry can be translated from its native tongue into another without destroying its original sweetness and harmony. It might feel obliged to, oops. Okay, I am going to scroll, sorry. It might feel obliged to wade once again into thorny questions of freedom versus fidelity. But it's worth remembering that Frost's locution that has been transmuted into Lost in Translation read in its entirety, quote, I like to say guardedly that I could define poetry this way. It is what gets lost out of both prose and verse in translation. So for Frost, as for Dante, poetry is some sonic quality and or some relationship between matter and meaning that doesn't survive the act of translation unchanged. As for the fight between freedom and fidelity, as far back as 1977, the year of O'Riordan's death, Belgian translation theorist Antoine Lefebvre was declaring that battle done, suggesting that the ideal translation is based on neither term of the antiquated opposition between fidelity and freedom. As with many phenomena posited as fixed binaries, freedom and fidelity are more usefully thought of as twin charged poles that any translational reading, right down to the level of individual word choice, circulates between. So if I'm revisiting that antiquarian opposition, it's because questions of freedom and constraint, fidelity and infidelity are the stuff of these poems, threaded through the sounds they're woven from. And for reasons that I hope will become clear, rhyme presents the ideal lens through which to view the interplay between these terms and the relationship between matter and meaning in O'Riordan's poem and Muldoon's. Damien Searles concludes his recent philosophy of poetry with a gloss on Frost's dictum. Since poetry is something words do, that particular poetry is lost when all of the words are changed. It's equally true, though, that poetry gets created in translation. For the new words in the new language are in a new relationship with the idea, and they convey whatever they convey in a new way within a new linguistic system for a new audience. I will come back to these questions of system and audience at the end, but first we need to think about what the poem Saoirse is doing and how rhyme is central to its doing of it. In thinking about uses of rhyme, I'm going to defer to Jack Spicer, poetic one of a kind, beating heart of the Berkeley Renaissance, whose thoughts on creative translation, composition by the book, and poetic dictation have been central to my own work. I'm deferring to Spicer here, not just because that has always been my instinct in thinking about poetry, but because I hear remarkable resonances between his poetics and that of his near contemporary Sean O'Riordan. Spicer once wrote that loneliness is necessary for pure poetry, and that same generative uigness echoes through O'Riordan's work. It's okay. It's okay. For both men, poetry was an act of transmission for which the poet was a conduit. While that's a view of poetry as old as Orpheus, in the work of both of these poets, it is expressed in vividly proliferating and restlessly morphing sequences of metaphors. In Spicer's Vancouver lectures, delivered shortly before his death in 1965, we read of poets who are radios receiving transmissions from another dimension. In some versions of this exchange, aliens appear bearing gifts of metaphors. In others, they behave more like an intergalactic removal agency, arranging and rearranging the furniture in the poet's room, which may or may not include a radio that may or may not be the poet. In the preface to O'Riordan's Arable Spidoiga, Robin's Tale, he tells us, among other things, that poetry is the sound of a horse trotting, the sound of a horse trotting in the mind of a child, the prayer of the sound of a horse trotting in the mind of a child. It is braille, it is a lung, it is a prayer. Mireille Massé, in her wonderful book Une pluie d'oiseaux on birds in poetry, describes writing about a murmuration of starlings in the following terms, my translation. The writing is, in a way, running after form. It's a wedding between metaphor and metamorphosis, between image and becoming, end quote. This seems an apt description of the dynamic at the heart of the two ornithologist poets Spicer and O'Riordan. The phenomenon they're trying to describe, like the movement of 1,000 birds in concert, is too fluid and protean to pin down in a single static image. For Spicer, the purpose of this dynamic was to keep the poem moving, to prevent the poet from getting bogged down in the dross of the personal. Any and all formal and sonic constraints were to be welcomed insofar as they kept the poet from focusing on himself. I think that's one of the advantages of rhyme, that it restricts the personal of the poet. But it seems to me that it's like wearing a straitjacket in order to restrict you from scratching your nose. The constraint of a rhyme scheme offers negative freedom of a limited kind. It frees you from the poor personal hygiene of picking your nose or at your old wounds. But are there other freedoms to be found within the bonds of rhyme? And at what cost? The reading of Saoirse that follows will consider its straitjacket of rhyme, attempting to answer the following questions. How tightly fitted is it? What is it made of? What does it prevent? What does it allow? I'm oversimplifying here, but rhyme in modern Irish poetry generally centres on vowel sounds. While earlier forms such as Dawn Díreach had complex rules dictating agreement within consonant classes, in modern Irish, rhyme is primarily repetition of closely related vowel sounds. So from the outset, the straitjacket of Irish rhyme has potential for greater flexibility than anything that would strictly be called a rhyme scheme in English. Let's have a look at how this plays out in the opening stanzas of Saoirse. Raig me sias I measc na nina, the hiúl mo chos, is raig me sias an ocht. Raig me sias ag lurg díirse, on minna bhíirse, tá ag liú an sa. This poem is like a sort of reverse Lake Isle of Innisfree, a journey of the imagination tracking its speaker's planned future movement down from an abstract hill of the imagination, of the poetic license governing the speaker's eccentric use of the Irish language, to seek the comfort of constraint among the people with their fixed routines, limited thinking, and trade in stock phrases. While its opening tercet contains a rhyming couplet around the O sound of cos, leg, and a nocht, tonight, the rest of the poem is a long rhythmic play on the E sound central to Saoirse, freedom, and its opposite, Díirse, constraint. This pair is an example of a beautiful and untranslatable phenomenon in Irish rhymed antonyms where the positive term begins with an S and the negative with D. So Sinan is good weather and Dunan bad weather. Succor, profit, and Duchar, loss. The poem establishes its primary rhyme pattern in an echo between Dirsha and Binabhirsha, a compound coinage literally meaning venom freedom, ensuring that these intertwined concepts are bound together, not just conceptually, but more importantly sonically, right through to the poem's final lines. Louis de Puer identifies a creative tension between tradition and imagination as the animating dynamic of O'Riordan's poetry and poetics, a perpetual movement over and back between two poles which can neither be collapsed into one nor abandoned. In a recording made towards the end of his life, O'Riordan talks about rejecting tradition to get Cead Cainthe, permission to speak, and then going back to it when he's sick of hearing himself. And that creative push and pull shapes the form and content of this poem. The opening line locates its signature E sound in the heart of Dina, the people, proposed refuge of the lonely and free speaker, and most of the poem's stanzas from the second on take the form of tercets, with an opening couplet rhyming this phoneme with either a rhymed or an unrhymed third line. It is a remarkably flexible form, a straitjacket with enough lycra content to combine a high level of support with ease of movement. This idiosyncratic partial freedom is also visible in its distinctive use of punctuation, with a string of colons linking together chains of stanza-length clauses. Where O'Riordan's beloved Emily Dickinson favoured the radical openness of the M-dash, O'Riordan's colons linked the phases of the poem's thinking loosely but definitively. There are only two stanzas which depart from the tercet form, and these are worth looking at more closely. After an opening movement seeking out a people who have no dealings with freedom or loneliness, who exchange their shilling thoughts like money, the speaker turns in a quatrain to directly address those people. O fanadliv de lo is diha, is be me ishil, is be me dealish, de voersnabs muinta. Maar de hule eed ag fos imintin, ag fos gan quisha, gan vazarupt. I will stay with you night and day, and I will be humble and I will be faithful to your stub thoughts. The speaker, in a quartet of rhymed lines, declares allegiance to the limitations that will cure him of his accursed freedom and prostrates himself before the people who embody those constraints. In the next tercet, he tells us that he has felt these same stub thoughts growing in his own mind without restraint or moderation, suggesting that the relationship between lonely speaker and limited people, like that between freedom and constraint, is a circulation between poles, or a movement like joining and peeling away from a murmuration, not a fixed, immutable binary. Not only that, but the longed-for, constraining stub thoughts themselves proliferate wildly and without restraint in the mind of the speaker and in the body of the poem, which unfolds in a cascading series of rhymed tercets, which Sean O'Tuama describes as versi chuma liadán, verses with the appearance of a litany, building to what he calls a triumphant canticle of all the things from alphabets to clocks to mass times that set limits on people's liberty to think and speak and use their time. This flood is brought to a halt by the final stanza, whose abstract hills find their concrete counterpart in the verse mountain that closes this poem's iteration of the dynamic interplay between freedom and constraint. Tired is the mind that falls in the deep trench of freedom, where no God-created hills live, only the abstract hills of the imagination, where desires climb and climb without the possibility of satisfaction, and there is no relief to be found. Every line of this climbing rhymes until the final one, the verb le fall, to be found, which will also be heard by many readers as a fall from the hill, since Irish is as entangled with English as freedom is with constraint. I recently had the pleasure of listening to a paper by Margot Griffin Wilson about the 18th century poet Dávi Ó Brúdar, and was reminded that many poems of this era took the form of a series of quatrains, followed by a longer final stanza called a ceangal or binding that pulled together the poem's themes. This poem pulls together the threads of its journey down the mountain from freedom to constraint in a binding that takes the shape of a mountain. It performs a gesture of allegiance to traditional poetic structures, but makes its own individual form in which to do so. O Tuama sums this paradoxical bondage up as nobody is free but the one who's tied. A perspective that offers a tempting degree of freedom to the translator, who is bound to the movement of sound and sense, matter and meaning in the source poem. This being the case, the next section asks why, when already wearing the bondage pants of another man's poem, would a translator poet or a poet translator choose to also slip on the straitjacket of rhyme? And this is where we move on to our second poem, Freedom. Thank you. The interrelation of the twin roles of poet and translator can be as fluid and protean as the interplay of freedom and constraint. Jack Spicer demonstrated as much in his book-length translation After Lorca, which runs through a spectrum of fidelity from entirely invented new work to poems that closely inhabit the thematic and sonic terrain of Lorca's. Laurie Chamberlain notes that, quote, Spicer's translation theory is remarkably similar to Walter Benjamin's, which argues against a representational model for translation, proposing instead an organic model. The translation does not reproduce the original, but completes it, providing for the continued life of the poem, end quote. Chamberlain also suggests that for postmodern writers like Spicer, translation can be open and playful while still being, quote, serious in undermining those definitions of truth, of authority, of originality that have been held sacred. It is striking in this context that Muldoon eschews the designation version or the preposition after for even the loosest of his translations, as noted with refreshing acidity by Corinna Hollow in an essay on his Nuala ní Dhomhnaill translations. It's as if he's refusing the act of authorial or even chronological submission that the affixing of this humble preposition might imply. He further complicates this in the end of the poem, saying, quote, I want to go further than Lowell and propose, 1, that the poetic translation is itself an original poem, 2, that the original poem on which it's based is itself a translation, and 3, that both original poem and poetic translation are manifestations of some ur-poem. I shy away from the last idea, of course, since it smacks of a Platonism I can't quite stomach, end quote. On the one hand, this seems in keeping with Spicer and Benjamin's organic continuation of the life of the poem. On the other, it remains highly invested in the sanctity of ideas of authority and originality that they sought to undermine. I propose that these tensions and others are made flesh in the rhyme scheme he imposes on his translation of Saoirse. Poet translators and translation theorists alike have warned of the double bondage of rhymed translation. Peter Manson, a contemporary Scottish poet and translator whose reworkings of Mallarmé range from concrete erasure poems to rhymed sonnets, gives the following explanation of his decision not to use rhyme in his book-length translation of the Poésie, the poems in verse. Quote, I didn't even consider using rhyme. I know that rhyme is an essential feature of Mallarmé's verse, but that is only true of his rhymes. Mine would not be essential, and I didn't want to distract. End quote. This is not the approach Muldoon takes in Freedom. As we have seen, rhyme is an essential feature of O'Riordan's poem. It weaves the interplay of freedom and constraint through the poem in sonic form, a feat that doesn't lend itself to replication in English. Searles has suggested that, quote, a translator operates under an especially strong constraint to produce a text that's a translation of the original, not some random new thing, end quote. I would argue that Muldoon repudiates this constraint, producing something else, to borrow a title from a much discussed sonnet of his in his Rhyming of Freedom. Muldoon's scheme is established in the first 6 lines. I'm going down among the ordinary people. I'm going to get up on my own 2 feet and go right down to where they're gathered tonight. I'm going down in search of some good old servitude instead of this poisonous freedom stuff that turns out to be so grim and gruff. From a visual standpoint, it's striking that the stanzas have all been knocked into one big room, like some Celtic Tiger era house renovation. Sonically, the rhythmic and open rhyme structure has been replaced by a series of unrhymed lines, followed by unmetered, mostly masculine rhyming couplets, reminiscent of the shuffling oom-pa-pa rhythms of the country and Irish circuit. Corinna Hollow has identified a certain, quote, lack of empathy for the tone and texture of the original, end quote, as a feature of Muldoon's nihonal translations, identifying tendencies to, quote, alter and improve, to make things more whimsical, end quote, and perhaps more seriously, a push towards closure and what she calls, quote, an unnecessary fixity of meaning, end quote. All of these qualities feature in this translation too, perhaps most clearly in the former quatrain and tercet, in which the speaker of the source poem addresses the reader. I'll stick with you day and night, keeping my head down, sing loyal only to the crop crown. I've had thoughts springing of late in my skull, these thoughts springing of late, unruly and intemperate. Gone is the extended moment of connection with the people, the promise to be humble and faithful to their stub thoughts, the acknowledgement that these same thought patterns are proliferating wildly in the speaker's mind. In their place, we get the coinage crop crown and the stumbling half rhyme of late, intemperate. Muldoon revels in a far greater degree of flexibility in the rhyme schemes of his own poems than he does anywhere here, and this is not, as I hope is becoming clear, out of any desire to be humble and faithful to the source poem's own rhymes. An Riordanach himself often used rhyme playfully, as in An Lacha, which rhymes Don Dhearach with Vers Libre, but that's not the case in Saoirse. Much scholarship on Muldoon's work centres on his idiosyncratic rhyming. Andrew Osborne coined the term fuzzy rhyme to describe his consonant-centred innovations, claiming that, quote, one can ignore all vowels when seeking to determine whether two line endings feature fuzzy rhyme. Like the bellows of a melodeon or accordion, Muldoon's rhymes may be inflated with air or all but deflated through compression, end quote. More recently, Eric Falchi has noted that Muldoon's work is suggestive of, quote, an author-maker holding it all together, one who experiments by leveraging a seemingly inexhaustible word hoard in the service of the elaboration of baroque or novel rhyme schemes, end quote. Neither of these descriptions seem to fit freedom. Heal, feel, in it, minute, see free, rearrange, change, stand second hand. These are rhymes plucked clean of all fuzz, trussed up in mock heroic couplets. Osborne bases his elaboration of the form and strategic use of fuzzy rhyme on the poem Something Else, a sonnet concerning the death of Gérard de Nerval that incorporates an untranslated line of his and bursts out of the sonic form with the addition of a 15th line. For Osborne, this poem is, quote, as much about rhyme's constraints as Nerval's idiosyncrasies and misfortunes. Something Else is, in a sense, Muldoon's answer to Keats's sonnet, if by dull rhymes our English must be chained, end quote. It would be hard to find duller rhymes in the English language than freedom's up, pup, yup, offering the possibility that Muldoon is deploying this clunky doggerel as a means of critiquing the conventions of the English poetic tradition itself. In the Convivio, Dante rejects the use of Latin in his prose commentaries, arguing that, quote, Latin would have been not subject to my canzoni, but sovereign over them, end quote, suggesting that a refusal to surrender to the agency of a poem in a minor language is a hazard of translation into a major language. In Muldoon's Freedom, the English language exercises this sovereignty by bulldozing O'Riordan's stanzas into one and snipping the supple thread of his rhyme into dull couplets. If, as O'Tuama has it, no one is free but the one who is tied, what could be freer than this trussed-up poem? Freed from its tercets, its binding final stanza, its rhyme scheme drawn from the paired SD antonyms of a minor language, it's free to take its place, unshackled to any parallel original poem, as forward to the volume presenting this minor language poet to readers in the language of global hegemony. If the reader is left with the sense that the author-maker holding it all together has the source poem in a chokehold, that too is audible in the clipped rhymes in which it stakes its claim to original poemhood. The English language might refuse to submit to the authority of a minor language poem, but the same might be said for a poet translator from a minor to a major language. Alan Titley has proposed that literature in Irish is counter-colonial or uncolonised. It is literature that didn't submit to colonising, but warns of its vulnerability to translation that extinguishes as it enlightens, so that once the minor language has been translated into the major one, the source text is eclipsed. Gayatri Spivak has argued, in the context of translation into globally dominant languages, that the translator must surrender to the text, that, quote, unless the translator has earned the right to become the intimate reader, she cannot surrender to the text, cannot respond to the special call of the text. It could be argued that if Muldoon was inclined to surrender to this text's rhythmic litany, to be humble and faithful to something else, source poem, ur poem, dictation, rather than asserting authorial ownership over the original poem of his translation, he might be better placed to respond to that call. Searles claims that the translator is trapped in this conundrum, to be free and wrong, or right and confined. I would like to end by proposing that a sufficiently forceful author-maker can burst the bonds of that conundrum, leaving us with a poem that is free, constrained, right, wrong, and something else again, a gossamer thread transformed into a length of chain.
Questions now, is that okay?
Yeah, that's it here.
Yeah, so I should have explained. We're gonna. First of all, that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Ellen. That was amazing, incantatory. I don't know, it was stirring, beautiful lecture. Thank you so much. I just wanted to explain. So we're going to do 20 minutes, sort of roughly, or sort of. Sorry, after the speakers, we'll do about 10 minutes of questions or so. Now, after each one, rather than grouping everybody together, the questions together at the end, if that makes sense. So. Does anybody have any questions for Ellen?
May I have just a technical one? Are you recording the questions?
Yeah, yes.
I'll keep mine for a bit.
We are recording them?
Yeah, but I think if there are people following online, you're going to need to hear what Ellen says.
Okay. Okay, all right. Sorry, Ellen. Okay, yes, any questions at all? Yes.
As a corset, yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I think there is a difference because, I mean, I'm not saying that all rhyme translations are bad, and I'm not necessarily even saying that this translation is bad, although it may be read as saying that. But I think there's a difference between translating a form that is shared between the source poem and the replication of the form, and what looks more like shoving something into a corset that was wearing, you know, a loose nightie in the original. You know, it's like, it feels like a different type of play with form, and one that's less comfortable, I think, than replicating a sonnet from one language and rhyme tradition in another language and rhyme tradition.
Any further questions? Yes. Hello.
Kind of, I was back to the agree with the revision, but I kind of my ears, but when you mentioned Spivak at the end, Spivak's talking very specifically about minoritized women.
She is, yeah.
So I don't think she could even imagining what Muldoon is doing, or even necessarily imagining poetry. She's actually asking us to be sort of more attentive to those.
Absolutely, yeah. Doubly minoritized writers, because gender-wise and in minoritized language. Absolutely, and I may be taking a liberty of my own in bringing that in there, but I do think that there are questions, and they are uncomfortable questions, around well, yes, gender, but also like relationships, power dynamics between languages, between minoritized languages. I mean, like to my mind, you can have at Mallarmé with a heart and a half, because if you do something terrible to him, there's like 50 other translations that are out there, and plenty of people can read him in the original. And like, I'm not somebody who thinks that like you can destroy a poem by making an erasure of it or by making a translation of it. Absolutely not. But I think there are different power differentials and different things to be mindful of in a language where it can be understood that the vast majority of readers who are going to access this poem are accessing it in the majority language that it's been translated into. So there is a degree of responsibility there. And maybe it is a bit of a liberty to bring Spivak in on that, because as you say, that is from a different context. But I think it raises questions that are useful to think about in the area of, you know, minoritized minor languages, major languages, and the translation from one to the other.
When you were talking about kind of not destroying, but playing with an original text, it made me think about what you were saying as well, with how a translation could be a completion of a text, and that made me also think about play texts and theatre. Made me think about how a play text is almost a skeleton that isn't completed until the performance is completed. Yeah. And then that destroying thing is also like the Simon Russell Beale thing about Shakespeare, right? Where you can do anything with Shakespeare.
Yeah, because he's big enough
to take it. He's big enough to take it.
He'll still be there. And this is in the context of something that I'm thinking about a lot in my own creative practice and writing, and going back to Irish and reading between Irish and translate. Like, there is a tendency in translation from Irish into English to smooth things out, and to kind of go, oh no, what the poet was really wanted to say was this, to kind of like presume that the original language that the poem was written in somehow didn't have the capacity to say that thing. Like, there's one particularly egregious one that I can't remember, fortunately, the names of any of the guilty parties, but a recent poem that was published in a journal where the Irish poem had the line Kraken na Hishka, which is the skin of the water, and the English translation had the meniscus. And like, you know, the Irish language has the word meniscus, it's on meniscus. And like, you know, if the poet wanted to say that, so it's like, oh, I'm gonna give you a shortcut here. Like, this is a long-winded, a clunky way of saying the meniscus. Like, who's ever put a meniscus in a poem? Like, and there's a lot of that. And I don't know if it's something that particularly happens in translation from Irish into English, but it's something that I'm reading and finding a lot of in that area.
Can I ask, and that was brilliant, and sorry, I'm just loving this kind of metaphors, gifts from aliens, and all your wonderful, wonderful quotations, vast array of poets that you put in, and also talking about Dan did some kind of criticism of the translation practice, you know, when he writes about people. But I'm always curious, because I have not quite arguments, but discussions with people constantly when we talk about, and this isn't necessarily related to rhyme, but rhyme is part of it, but when you have professional translators translating poems, and then you have poets translating poems, and I know Corinna's looking at me, she said, something if they're not translations. I'm interested in the kind of alchemy of the poet translation figure, be it Paul or Dillon or whoever, looking at an original, and something else is happening. Is translation, is it something new, something emerging? And to this day, I've heard of tradaptation, I've heard of all kinds of different terms, but not one of them, to my mind, basically encapsulates what's happening there. And I was wondering, did you have any thoughts on that particular process? Sorry.
Yeah, lots of thoughts and lots of questions, and very few answers that I'm satisfied with for myself, even in my own writing. But one of the things that I keep coming back to is the idea, like, I've taken liberties, horrendous liberties. In one of my pamphlets, like, I do things to Pasolini's Le Ceneri di Gramsci that he would have hated, like he would have. One of them is a mashup between one of his poems and lyrics from the fall, and he would have hated them. And that's why we have after, and we have versions, and we kind of, you know, have these strategies that we use to identify that what we're doing is our own take. And it's complicated because in one way you're kind of stealing the poem and making it your own by saying after, but on the other hand it's a mark of respect. It's kind of an after you. It's like, I'm not claiming I'm not speaking for Pasolini. Pasolini would not do this if he was doing this now. He would be after me with a hatchet. But like, you're making it clear to the reader that you are taking a liberty and that you're doing something different, and that you're not attempting to replicate or complete or provide an equivalent for, however complicated and that idea of equivalency might be, of the source poem. And I think if you refuse to do that, or if you don't countenance doing that, and if you call what you're doing translation, even when the liberties that you're taking are egregious, then I think that's a problem. Like, I've no problem with absolutely creative interactions with texts, and that's how poetry keeps working, keeps going, and like, it's like 97% of my own work. But there has to be like that, especially in poetry that people are very less likely to read in its original form. There has to be a sense of like a sense of that if this is after, or if this is a version, or if this is your creative reworking or updating or adapting, that it's, you know, that it's named as such. Like,
Could I comment on that very briefly? And in addition, Dara has probably heard me say before, I worked with Kieran Carson, the Belfast book, on his rendering of a Montalic book. And we had 3 email exchanges, in each of which I was hammering on the mistakes, so to speak. And there was one constant he wouldn't change. And on the 3rd email, he wrote back to me. He said, I've got your point, but I want it my way. And it taught me, I'm a jobber, I'm a translator. I would never take liberty with the original, the way that he took it with Montalic.
yeah.
But he's a poet.
He's a poet, yeah.
I'm not. So
And
I
it's,
make the distinction.
yes, and I think it's very interesting that it's specifically Carson, because he has engaged with Sean O'Riordan's work as well. And to my mind, the most beautiful and translation of any of O'Riordan's poems is his translation of Rayson, which doesn't rhyme. And he said that he would love to have translated more Sean O'Riordan, but it nearly took him his whole life to get that one poem down to his satisfaction. So there wasn't, no.
I did see Emma and Valentina's hands. I'm not. Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah. Okay. We can go, but can we try and keep it as possible?
No,
Is that okay? We've got some other people to get through. Is that okay? Okay. I think I saw Emma and then Valentina and then Martine.
It's just a follow-up question based on what Corinna and Dara was just saying there. As you, I'm sure you know, because you've probably been, attended quite a few meetings in Swan a couple of years ago. It was the 250th anniversary of the Queen Artie there of the Salvadori, and of course there are lots of translations in existence. New ones have come out. 2 in particular, John Stern's excellent translation, which was launched here in the Steps. Still not sure the Steps. But anyway, we had an awful lot of discussions about these translations at the time, and just exactly what you're saying there. I'd just be interested to hear what you thought yourself, what you think yourself about the original text that left behind, why the translation, the need for the translation to bring it to a wider public, and then all those problems in between. Did you have any thoughts yourself about it?
So many, and I have no answers. Like, yeah, none.
Discussions with Dara about it, Jason about it. We could see in my colleague, in my department, and Kevin Murray was there, and Aidan was there, and it's a very difficult question to approach or to answer.
Yeah. And like, I suppose the fact, like, I think more translation is better. So like, I think for a work that exists in like 50 different forms, it doesn't matter if all of us do something slightly terrible in each of our versions, because there's enough out there that, you know, a diligent reader can, you know, get as close, you know, find a version that works for them or whatever. I think it's more of a problem when the only, like when you've got a particular poem shackled to a particular translation and limping through the world with only that as its, you know, representative on earth. I think that's a problem. I think lots and lots of translations that are doing different things in different ways is definitely better than this is the definitive translation of this particular poet and that's what you're getting. Good luck.
Yeah, that's what I think that was kind of the conclusion we were coming to. Various people do different things with it, and yeah, an impossible one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Antina?
Yeah, this is just a very good comment. Thank you again very much. I was thinking again about the Spicer tools, or about the Spicer quotation in this line where you talk about orange and basically the poet wants to say something, but not say that, because if the poet saying what he wants to say, he's not making poetry. Because poetry is not possible. This is my thought, like curiosity, is about the fact that often rhymes is taken as the scapegoat of this tension between the mother tongue and the natural language, the vernacular, and the translations or the new language or the old language. So I thought this was why this tension.
As in it's English's fault, basically, for not having the. Well, I mean, there are things in that Reardon poem, like that specific rhyme that the whole poem hinges on. You can't possibly replicate that in English. And there's another translation of that poem that has freedom and confinedom just in the opening stanza, just as a way of marking that parallel. And you can't obviously replicate the rhyme schemes of a source language. You have to work within the conventions of the form and how that form works in the language that you're translating into. And there are all sorts of questions around that, absolutely. But like, what really got under my skin about this poem, this particular one, and made me want to write about it, was just the clunkiness. Like, English isn't always as clunky as it is in that particular translation, and Muldoon's English is not as clunky as it is in that translation. And like a variation of this paper used the word Muldooning for what he was doing to the poem. But then I rescinded it because I was like, he's not Muldooning. If he was Muldooning, the rhymes would be way more interesting and surprising. So like, it's not even that. Sorry.
Okay, one last question, Martine, and then we have to move on.
It's quick, really, and it's about moving. It's great that you brought that up. I was very interested in the quotes that are about Reardon's conflicted relationship with the tradition. And he was close to it, and he felt the need to move away from it, but then he became a constructor. And my feeling is that Muldoon, as a translator, is probably sometimes more successful than others, but he doesn't feel that conflicted relationship with any tradition. And I was wondering what you think of that.
I think that's true, and I also think if there are conflicts with tradition and that are being played out, it's with English and English rhyme and the conventions of English rhyme, and I just don't know why you would do that in that particular forum of translating somebody else's poem. And like, I know I said this maybe twice in the paper, and I'm sorry for hammering on about it, but like, it's not just that it's a translation, but like, it's the foreword to the first collection of Sean O'Riordan's poems to go into the English speaking world. So like, it's, you know, it's kind of the way it positioned. Yeah, I have nothing. I wouldn't have written the paper if I had anything succinct to say about that, so I'll stop rambling. But I just think it's problematic, and like, you know, that's the first thing you read when you pick up this book. You've never heard Sean O'Riordan or anything about him, and this is the first thing you read. Pop, pop, puff, up, pop, I can't even say it, I'm sorry.
Thank
Words have
you, Ellen.
failed, words have failed, thank you.
No, please, everybody give Ellen a round of applause. Thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, please. Emma Nicorhi. So, Emma Nicorhi is a lecturer in early and medieval Irish in University College Cork and a member of the Locust Project. Her research interests include literary and historical analysis of early Irish lyric poetry and classical modern Irish poetry, edition and translation of old, middle, and classical modern Irish texts, particularly poetry, modern Irish translations of Dante's Divina Commedia, Irish onomastics, and medieval Irish eschatology. So please join me in welcoming Emma. Just gonna get you your... Is it? Do I have to stop sharing and then reshare, or can I just? Okay. Okay. Great. Por favor. I know. I'm just. Yeah, I did. I don't know why it's not taking it from the beginning.
Is it? How annoying. It doesn't really matter.
Is it not really matter? It's a little annoying.
It is very annoying. How typical. How typical of my luck.
Shall I shut it down and start again? What do you think?
Yeah. I hope that the whole thing isn't fucked.
Yeah, that'll be from current slides. Let's try that.
Let me have a look and see if the whole thing's fucked.
Okay. Okay.
Oh no, it's actually not. No, I'll get the memory stick.
Sorry about this, everybody. Let me try.
Start from the beginning.
No. Yeah, it just wasn't. There we go.
Yeah.
We
Really?
got it. Yeah. I think we're okay.
Okay.
Any problems we can.
What happened there? I wonder.
I just shut it down and then restart.
Oh, very good.
Right, reboot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Emma.
Sorry about that, everybody. Hello, everybody, and many thanks to George for the invitation to speak today. It's lovely to be here in spite of the summer that is passing us by outside, because this is it. Those of you who weren't born here, this is it. I only noticed this morning that this colloquium aims to reevaluate the place of rhyme in poetic theory and contemporary poetic practice. I hadn't noticed the word contemporary there. We're going back to medieval times here, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. This talk is all about sound, song, and metrical music, as is suggested by this attribution of a bardic poem to the 16th century poet Carthaigh mac Dara. From the time of the pre-Christian classical commentators such as Posidonius, who wrote about the continental Celts, to the collapse of insular British and Irish poetic traditions in the 13th and 17th centuries respectively, Celtic poetry has been rooted in the science of sound and the art of singing. And when I use the term British here, I use it in the historical sense to refer to the Celtic peoples of the island of Britain who were ancestors of the Welsh. Among the various British and Irish words for poet are terms meaning bard or craftsman, as you see here, and poetry itself is termed in Welsh hain gerdd, old craft, and in Irish card, meaning craft, or also Irish dawn, meaning artistic faculty, especially the art of poetry. The British poets' compositions are referred to as their canny, or song. In both traditions, the poet craftsman applied his skill in the art of poetry to the composition of verse, according to a series of strict metrical rules, all relating to harmony between sounds. Sounds that harmonized within the verse created poetic music by means of the rules of rhyme. Then, when it was performed, another stave was added to the layers of harmony in the verse. For this poetry was always recited to the accompaniment of a harp. Thus, the performance of any poem constituted the layering of two kinds of music. In the Irish manuscript tradition, when a poet is named alongside their compositions, they are said to have sung them, as is the case here, where the scribe tells us that Carthaigh mac Dara Kekinit sang the poem preserved on this folio of the Book of the O'Connor Don, which preserves a compilation of 353 bardic poems of the 13th to the 17th centuries. This brings me to singing, and what I mean by singing in chains in the title of this talk. I borrowed the title from the name of the book whose cover you see here. Mererid Hopwood's Singing in Chains, Listening to Welsh Verse comprises a comprehensive study of the art of Welsh versification. Anyone here who studied Dillon Thomas's Fern Hill for the old intercert will hear in Hopwood's title the echo of the last lines of Fern Hill. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. Hopwood borrowed Thomas's idea not for its expression of existential pain and the passage of time, but for the image that it afforded her for her study of the exigencies of the rules of Welsh rhyme and metre, which professional Welsh poet craftsmen had to apply and abide by in the composition of their poetry, which they termed their canny or song, and still render that song meaningful. Irish poets worked with a different set of rules for rhyme and metre, but they also considered themselves singers, and their songs were also bound about by the chains or the straitjackets that Ellen mentioned of those rules. In the time that is left, I would like to give you a sense of the metrical chains that our poets were so gifted at applying to their song. This summary of Gerard Murphy's survey of the three main periods in the history of Irish versification demonstrates the chronological development of Irish poetry from the pre-Christian period to the 18th century. Today, I will be considering the metrical system of the second period, during which a new kind of poetry emerged from the monastic environment from the 7th century onwards, under the influence of continental Christian hymn meters that were based on a fixed number of syllables in the line, and that arrived in Ireland with the arrival of Christianity from the 5th century onwards. These new meters, inspired by these hymn meters of the Christian tradition, spread out from the monasteries and beyond the devotional poetry of the monastic sphere into the sphere of the professional praise poet of secular lords and kings, where these meters became the backbone of the bardic poetry of 1200 to 1650. This is why the second period of Irish versification falls into two distinct parts. And my focus today is the second part. The poetry of circa 1200 to circa 1650 is designated bardic poetry, syllabic poetry, because it maintains a fixed number of syllables in the line, classical modern Irish poetry, Filioch na Scoil, meaning the poetry of the schools, or Dawn Díreach, meaning strict verse. I will stick with the latter term as I proceed. Dawn Díreach was composed by professional court poets who specialised in composing formal praise poetry for a lord or king. They also composed satires, laments, and political and religious poetry. The first example on this slide is the attribution to Carthaigh that we encountered already. This work is a combination of a praise poem and a speculum principis, and we are told in the book of the O'Connor Donn that he sang it for Donogha O'Brien, 4th Earl of Thomond. The second item on the slide is an attribution of a religious poem to the 16th century poet Aeneas Fionn O'Dala. And you can see in both of these, the poets are said to have sung Carthaigh in Latin, Cecinit, and Aeneas Fionn O'Dala, Duchan, he sang in Irish. There are many things to say about Dawn Díreach, but today's event is all about rhyme. And when we talk about rhyme in relation to Dawn Díreach, we are talking about phonetic harmonies composed by poets who were considered to be singers of poetic music. This much is also true of British poetry. The compositions of the 6th century praise poet Aneurin are known as Canny Aneurin, or the singing of Aneurin. Likewise, the compositions of the 7th century noblewoman Heledd are known as Canny Heledd. As we have already seen, copies of the work of Irish poets are often preceded with statements in either Latin or Irish that the poet sang the text to follow. Carthaigh mac Dara Cecinit, or Duchan O'Dala. Considering that musicality is at the core of the poetic craft, therefore, it is not very surprising that the terms that the medieval Welsh and Irish poets used for rhyme, canghanedd and crivjus or crivus, and I forgot my pointer. I went to a lot of trouble to retrieve my pointer yesterday, big long stick, never mind. And these two terms, canghanedd and crivus, mean harmony. In what follows, I will endeavour to give you a sense of what quivus, and I'll use the modern pronunciation, it's much easier, in medieval Irish poetry is, by filtering it through the points of interest that George drew up for this colloquium and that are printed on the programme alongside the Murmuration of Starlings. The first of these points that I wish to consider is whether or not there are language-specific preoccupations with rhyme. In the case of medieval Irish bardic poetry, it would seem that there are, beginning with the word for rhyme itself. As I have mentioned, the word for rhyme in Old Irish is quivus. This does not derive from the Greek rhythmos that gives us the English word rhyme. Rhythmos denotes repeating, repeated motion, ordered arrangement, or flowing. And it is the basis of the word for rhyme in numerous languages, such as the Romance and Germanic examples here in French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, German, Dutch, Icelandic, and Danish. Quivus, which derives from the adjective cuvus, meaning harmonious, literally means musical harmony, concord, or agreement, specifically of a metrical device, and it signifies rhyme. It also designates other metrical ornaments involving sound, such as alliteration and assonance. And I like this little page from the Inchculum Antiphonor denoting musical harmonies laid out on the stave there, and I couldn't resist putting it in, though it has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Quivus, when applied to poetry, denotes phonetic musicality and reflects a system that treated poetry as a kind of music. This idea, of course, is not particularly Irish. In a consideration of the measure of words and syllables in his treatise concerning enthusiasm, 17th century Geneva-born English classical scholar Merrick Casaubon observed, for example, that in all poetry there is somewhat of music. As I have mentioned already, the performance of medieval Irish bardic poetry constituted two distinct layers of music. The first created within the poetry itself, mainly by means of the rules of rhyme, the second consisting of accompaniment on a harp. In this very well-known woodcut image, and I think some of you probably groaned when you saw it coming up because you're sick of seeing it, of a lord feasting in the open air from John Derrick's Image of Ireland, the process of such a performance is depicted. You can see the harpist here alongside two cheeky buffoons tooting Latin hexameters out of their posteriors, who incidentally, and perhaps not surprisingly, were excised from our history book for the aforementioned old intercert. No surprise there. The character on the harper's other side, who appears to be acting out a story or performing a recitation, is not a poet, rather a rackere, or professional reciter. The poet's high status meant that his place was not to be reciting his own poetry for the court, but to be seated next to his lord, while the rackere would delight the lord and his retinue with the poet's offering, replete with poetic harmonies that dovetailed with the harmonies of the harp. The poet, incidentally, is not present in this illustration. The point of the complexity of the metrical rules of this verse was to display the poet's mastery of the craft, and he wields his mastery in order to honour his lord. Thus, both poet and lord are exalted by means of the verse. The more virtuoso the verse, the greater the glory for both of them. A scene just like this one in Derrick's Image of Ireland is described by Sir Thomas Smith in the promotional pamphlet that he published on being granted lands in I always get this wrong. What is it, Jason? Clandyboy, a county down by Elizabeth I in the 1570s. The pamphlet was intended to attract potential investors to the colonising project that Smith was developing, and it depicts the very rackere whom we have just met. Now comes the rhymer that made the rhyme with the rakery. The rakery is he that shall utter the rhyme, and the rhymer himself sits by with the captain very proudly. He brings with him also his harper, who plays all the while that the rakery sings the rhyme. So what is this rhyme? We could say a lot about Smith, but I'm not going to say it today. I'm more interested in the fact that he mentions rhyming and rhymers and rakeries. So what is this rhyme that he refers to? And to return to George's points of interest, can it be ruled by its own logic? Donzirch is certainly ruled by its own logic, and this much is evident in the extensive metrical primers that were compiled by bardic grammarians, first in the 7th century and later again in revised form in the 13th to 16th centuries. The opening lines of the earliest of these primers extant in the manuscript tradition and entitled Auricap Negus, or the Scholar's Primer, can be seen here from the Book of Ballymote. And here we see the opening lines of the later revised version, which is known to modern scholars as the Irish Grammatical Tracts, even though the work deals with metre as much as it deals with grammar. This tract states about itself that Here are many main branches of learning whose foundation is an initial training in the art of poetry. These are the workbooks for cuimhneas, or harmony, or rhyme in Irish Bardic poetry. Cuimhneas is later accompanied by the term coverdas or corda, meaning competing or metrical correspondence. And I am showing you this pig here playing the pipes as a suggestion that cuimhneas and corda are most certainly ruled by their very own idiosyncratic logic. Here are some of the metrical terms that we find in the tracts. I will be concentrating on those relating specifically to rhyme and that are shaded here. Perfect rhyme, imperfect rhyme, rhyme between a word at the end of one line and the interior of the next, and consonants. So what constitutes Don Díreach? And I will return to rhyme in a minute. Here are its main features: fixed syllable count, elision, cuimhneas, alliteration, assonance, and closure. I will consider the first three of these in turn. I can't really fit in the rest, and they don't really relate to what we are talking about today. Don Díreach could be composed combining various permutations and combinations of these features that I have just mentioned. Each different permutation was defined in the first instance by the syllable count in the 4 lines of the quatrain, that is the basic unit in Don Díreach. Each of these permutations were named as a particular aiste or meter. For example, Raníocht Mhór, or great versification, for which there are 7 syllables in each line, indicated in this modern notation here on the right, by the large numbers, and a monosyllable at the end of each line, indicated by the superscript numbers. In order to maintain correct syllable count, elision or drowning of vowels is often necessary, and it usually takes place when 2 or more unstressed vowels come together. But the rules, unsurprisingly, are much more complex than that, and I don't want to go into them here. They are quite dreary as well. But elision, the word for elision is báthas, or drowning. And then to cuimhneas, which can be perfect or imperfect according as pairs of rhyming words corresponding with each other obey the phonetic rules set down for them. Cuimhneas involves both vowels and consonants, and the variety whose main focus is consonants is known. Consonants is known as uithne. Uithne can be perfect or imperfect. It is this perfection in the correspondence of vocalic and consonantal sounds that brings about cuimhneas, as we will see. Vowels are considered according to quantity. They are either short or long. Consonants are divided into 6 classes, and Ellen referred to these earlier, and the consonants in each class share particular phonetic properties. Consonants also have the attribute of quality in that they are broad or slender. However, I won't dwell on that now, as I would like to look at the phonetic properties of class. The first class, as designated by the Bardic grammarians, comprises nutsi, hunsene, hruise, or the 3 hard consonants in modern terminology. That is voiced stops, B, G, and D, B, G, D. The second class, the 3 soft consonants, comprises the corresponding voiceless stops, K, P, T. The third class comprises the 3 rough consonants or voiceless continuants in more modern terminology, H, F, and Th. The fourth class comprises the 7 light consonants as designated by the Bardic grammarians, or voiced continuants in more modern terminology, and those are V, R, V, L, V, N, and R. The fifth class comprises the 5 heavy consonants or doubled voiced continuants, and L, M, N, N, and R, depending, and they sound different depending on the word. And the 6th class comprises S alone, a consonant that the Bardic grammarians describe as a barren consonant that is not correct in any form without another S corresponding to it. In modern terminology, it is a sibilant. So how does all this qualifying and quantifying of vowels, I sound like Mina now, and consonants come together to make cuimhneas? Perfect cuimhneas occurs between 2 words in which the stressed vowels are identical and all of the corresponding consonants subsequent to the first stressed vowel are of the same class and quality. You may be relieved to hear that the initial consonants do not need to be of the same class. This monosyllabic example will serve to illustrate these rules. In both the words God and log, the stressed vowel is identical. They're both A. And the corresponding consonants subsequent to that vowel, D in the case of God and G or G in the case of log, belong to the same class. That is class B, as designated by modern scholars, the 3 hard consonants, the first class. Imperfect quivus is a slightly more relaxed version of the foregoing set of rules, and it occurs between 2 words in which the stressed vowels are identical and between which there is agreement of the consonants in quality, that is broad or slender, but not in class. In this example, the stressed vowel e or e is identical in both, and the final consonants are both preceded by the letter a, denoting that they are both broad in quality. However, the subsequent corresponding consonants are not of the same class. The S of mass belongs to class S, and as you know, S is barren and can only rhyme with itself. And the th of lath belongs to class H, and is a rough consonant, a continuant, so it cannot rhyme with S. So the lack of phonetic harmony between these corresponding consonants renders the quivus imperfect. This disyllabic example, Fuishev Gwezel, of imperfect quivus further demonstrates the degree to which the medieval Irish bardic poet was singing in chains. Let us anatomize it again down to the level of the letter and see why the quivus between Fuishev and Gwezel is imperfect. The initial consonants do not count in the process. Stress historically always fell on the first syllable in Irish, and the stressed vowel here is a diphthong and is identical in both rhyming words. Therefore, we can move on. The first pair of consonants that occurs subsequent to the stressed vowel are of the same quality, that is slender, as indicated by the presence of the preceding letter I. However, S and the, or D, the DH there, the, do not harmonize phonetically speaking, as they belong to different classes. This breaks the perfection of the quivus. Moving on to the last corresponding pair of consonants, we find the corresponding to l, which belong to the same class of 7 light consonants. So this is a good example of imperfect rhyme, down to the level of the letter. And now a quick look at oithne, the form of quivus whose focus is more on consonants than on vowels. Oithne occurs between words when all their corresponding vowels are not identical but are of the same quantity, when all the corresponding consonants are of the same class, and when the final consonants are of the same class and quality. It's probably too hot in here to be dealing with this. But anyway, just stick with me for a moment and I will get to the literature in a minute. Thus, in the example of moor and gniv here, the stressed vowels u and e are not identical, but are both long. The final consonants r and v both belong to class the 7 light consonants. So therefore they rhyme, or they are in harmony with each other. So this example is where the focus is on the corresponding consonants belonging to the same class rather than the vowels being identical, but they are of the same length. So how does all this come together in a musical, harmonious, and simultaneously meaningful verse? And where are these rhyming or harmonizing pairs of words placed in the verse? I would like to demonstrate now how these rules of meter and quivus combine in an early 13th century example of Raniacht Voor, or great versification, the first of the meters that I showed you a minute ago. And I've chosen this early example. It's possibly not the best example because it doesn't fulfill all the exigencies of the rhyme, but it is a particularly beautiful example, and I think we need something beautiful after all this, after the foregoing, let's say. However, so I would like to demonstrate, as I said, how the rules of meter combine to create a poem. Here are the requisites for Raniacht Voor in Donzirich, according to the metrical tracts. And I should begin by noting that the bardic grammarians did not number the 4 lines of the quatrain. Rather, they used the ogham letters, Alam, Beth, Col, and Dar, these being the names of trees, and they denoted A, B, C, and D to refer to lines 1 to 4 of the quatrain, respectively. So, the first requisite is the toas, the count, the syllable count. And this comprises, in Raniacht Voor, 7 syllables in each of the 4 lines of each quatrain, as denoted by the large numbers. Each line of the quatrain must end with a monosyllable, or a monosyllabic word as denoted by the superscript numbers. In order to fulfill the requirements for cuivis in Raniach Dvor, there must be perfect end rhyme between lines B and D. There must be at least 2 perfect internal rhymes between lines A and B, and also between lines C and D. Internal rhyme denotes rhyme between words at the beginning or in the interior of the lines. Then there must be akel between lines C and D. Akel, meaning anticipation, is rhyme between a word at the end of one line and a word in the interior of the following line. There must be oisne or consonants between lines A and C. In addition to this, 2 words must alliterate in each line. I won't go into the rules for alliteration here, but they are, as you can imagine, complicated. And there must be fear oum, or true stitching, or true alliteration between the final word in line D and the preceding stressed word. And so, to the early example that I have chosen for you today of Raniach Dvor in its revised 13th century form. I have chosen this example largely because it not only fulfills the strict requirements mostly of the meter, almost fully to the letter, but also because, in spite of the pinch of his metrical chains, the poet sings here a deeply meaningful poem full of wordplay, metaphor, and oblique commentary on the strictures of monastic life. And rather than being impeded in his craft by the metrical chains that bind him, he makes a virtue of them by using them to lay emphasis on his wistful message, which echoes Ellen's reference earlier to Sean O'Tuama's observation that no one is free but one who is tied. And this will bring us to another of the points being considered today. That is the idea that rhyme can operate on the fringes between high literary stylistics and embodied sound, as we will see. But first, I will read this little verse. Then after we have anatomized the meter and the cuivis, the harmonies, I will read it again to see if you can hear those harmonies better, even though I am sorely lacking a racara and a harpist. Dara, get your harp out there. So I will read it first. Acholin is with it, coits of win noel the ned, as Trevig nach clin clog, as bin bug shitable head. Oh, blackbird, it is well for you, wherever your nest is in the thicket. Oh, hermit who rings no bell, sweet, soft, peaceful is your whistle. But to the meter first. As you see, he fulfills the toos, or the syllable count. I have raised the monosyllabic finals of each line to superscript to mirror the modern syllabic notation here. Then, elision between winne and a in line B is necessary to maintain the syllable count. There is perfect end rhyme as required between B and D with nad and tad. There must be at least 2 perfect internal rhymes between A and B according to the exigencies of the meter, and also between lines C and D. The first example is between win and il. Then, buize, winne, zisravig, shisavil, clind, bind. Akel, or the combination between end and internal rhyme, is present between clog and bug in lines C and D, while oum, or alliteration, is not present between 2 words in lines A and B as required, and the fear oum is absent between the final word of D and the preceding stressed word. There is, however, alliteration in line D between bind and bug, as you see, and compound or double alliteration between clind and clog. The cl alliterates with the cl, so you have the double alliteration there. So listen again and see if you can hear those harmonies a little better. Acholin is with it, coits of win noel the ned, as trevig nach clin clog, as bin bug shitable head. I'm very fond of this little poem. As I said a moment ago, the poet, rather than being impeded in his craft by the metrical chains that bind him, makes a virtue of them by using them to lay emphasis on his wistful message. This brings us to that question I posed a minute ago, quoting George, of how rhyme can operate on the fringes between high literary stylistics and embodied sound. In what ways do we see this here? A monastic cleric composed this poem by stating that it is well for the blackbird freely nesting away in the thicket. He is implying that it is not well for himself enclosed in the monastery. In fact, the opening word ah is described by the dictionary as an interjection generally denoting woe. So he starts off his little verse with an interjection denoting woe. So we know he's not happy. While the cleric lives the ascetic life of a monk and perhaps sometimes hermit, a particularly hard and frugal life that he chooses over an easier, freer one, the blackbird lives a similarly ascetic life, but one that is part of his own nature. He is like an unwitting metaphorical hermit, and the privations of hermit life do not bother him one bit. His true nest is in the thicket. Our cleric's nest is metaphorical and not a very comfortable one, in that it constitutes a monastic cell. And incidentally, the monastic cell here is like an upturned nest, you might notice. Whether he meant that or not, I don't know. A hermit must carry out acts of devotion to God, and it is in reference to this that the position of particular words in the verse is significant. The blackbird's acts of devotion are to carry out the gifts he has been given by God the Creator. That is nesting, as we see here on the right, the little chick, a perfect time of year for it. I have one hopping around my garden at the moment. And singing, as we see here on the left. Nesting and singing. These are the blackbird's gifts that have been given to him by the Creator. See how nad and fad, placed in metrically significant places in the verse, are placed in end rhyme. The poet's decision to place them as end rhymes lays emphasis on the blackbird's innate talents and the acts of devotion to his Creator. As I have said, the cleric poet seems disgruntled with life in the monastery and contrasts it somewhat implicitly and unfavourably to the free life of the blackbird, who is unfettered by walls while the cleric is enclosed. The blackbird is not hedged about by the ringing of the bell that calls monks to pray at the 8 canonical hours of the day. Our cleric doesn't seem too enamoured of the bell in this verse. The internal rhyme between clind and bind sets up a similar contrast. The onomatopoeia clind, meaning clangs or rings a bell, is a harsh sound in comparison with the softer bind, meaning melodious, that describes the sweetness of the blackbird's song. Similarly, see how the ackle rhyme between clog and bug expresses this same contrast. The harsh sound of the bell is echoed in the onomatopoeia clog, which echoes the clang of the bell, and which is set in perfect rhyme against the semantically contrasting bug, another of the adjectives describing the soft song of the bird. This set of contrasts is further pointed up by the poet's use of alliteration between clind and clog, where the first 2 letters alliterate. This echoes the harsh sound of the bell clanging, while the simple alliteration between bind and bug suggests the softness of the blackbird's song, cl, cl, as opposed to the. And the blackbird's song, of course, is his innate gift from God, in contrast to the metallic man-made music of the monastery's bell. Revealing all these subtleties and hidden meanings that are enhanced by and emphasized by the harmonies and sound systems of the meter brings me back to the first of today's points of interest. Are there language-specific preoccupations with rhyme? I think we can say yes in relation to medieval Irish bardic verse. And how might that affect the processes of translation? Well, as you can tell, it is impossible to emulate the exact processes of quivus in any other language. The phonetic rules for classical Irish verse are so precise that the subtleties of the rhyme or the harmonies are lost unless the reciter adheres to the sound system in pronunciation. In translation, all we can hope to do is to endeavour to convey the message of the verse. However, the harmonies and the chains that festoon them must remain sealed within the Irish language itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was absolutely fantastic and full of your usual detail. Well, you want to stay for questions or? You're not going away that easily. Well, I don't know. Yeah, maybe perhaps. Yes. Well, okay. How about we do this? So the coffee is now here, over on the left-hand side there.
There's a harper in there too.
And there's a harper in there too. Sadly, no butt trumpets, but you know we'll be all right. Do you want to go and help yourselves to coffee now while we're in the process of, and then you can gestate on questions for Emma, and then we'll come back and ask them. But before that, I just want to say thank you. That was just fantastic. Everything I could have ever asked for,
Including birds.
including birds. So yeah, go help yourself to coffee, and then we'll. Every time.
Every time.
Every time. Okay, everybody, thanks for settling down again rapidly. I know it can be like herding cats here. Right, does anyone have a question for Emma? Dara has a question for Emma.
Thank you.
Sounds like you prepared it earlier.
I don't think so. I don't know what you're talking about. Do you want to come into the camera?
Oh, yes.
So in the time, in the 12th and 13th century initially, there was a big distinction between a reevaluate and the poetic.
Mhm.
I was wondering in the Irish tradition, is this kind of dichotomy, this kind of binary, is it there?
Yes, more or less, exactly the same. And it's borne out a little bit in the terminology. We started out in the very early days with this word bord, coming from bardos in continental Celtic. And that term is maintained in Welsh to this very day. But in Irish, it lost its status and a new kind of poet came in called the file. And I was going to talk about him today, but I felt I should leave him out. And the file, the term bard became a much lower level kind of rhymer who was often an entertainer at court and composed lower grade poetry, and he could never rise through the ranks of the professional poet to reach the 7th rank in his training, whereas the file turns up, and the word file, meaning poet in Irish, derives from an old Irish verb, philis, meaning seas. And it is thought, but we just don't have the evidence for it, but we think that perhaps in the early Christian period, the poet, the bard, took on some of the roles of the druid and the prophet of the pre-Christian period. I suppose the role of an ability to foresee or to prophesy, and that he took those roles on himself when the druid and the prophet were being driven out in the new dispensation. And then therefore this new word, velitas, it's on the Ohm stones actually, one example of it, velitas, file, so that gives us a sense of how old the word is, but this new word, and he becomes the professional poet, and the term bard is a lower grade poet at court and so on. But yes, there is that exact same distinction, interestingly. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we are running slightly over. So okay, what I don't know. What do you think? Save it.
I'll answer very quickly.
Yeah, we're going to keep it really.
I'll ask the question. How long did it take that straight jacket to be unfixed?
Oh, the Battle of Kinsale dealt with it, you know. Yeah. 1601. Well, I mean, I suppose the Flight of the Earls in 1607, and the poets were no longer adhering to the lords had left, and the poets were left bereft, and they continued their syllabic meters for maybe another 50 years, but they started to move over to Auron meters or song meters, and these are the song meters we were talking about a moment ago, Corinna. Carthaigh made fasta gan aimed, thought Darren the guide to our lord, this stressed poetry. Yeah, so that's exactly, it's really that process, the political upheaval at the time. Yeah, Kevin.
You can go, and then I'm sorry, Jake. Well, come on.
It's like speed dating. Come on, I want my next date.
No, go on, Kevin, go on.
No, it's a compliment, because I thought the example you showed us was a beautiful piece of poetry, a lovely verse, but we were both also aware that the chains that you talked about for some bardic verse, both doesn't rise above.
Yeah, that's exactly true.
When a poet can take it, and it's what Em was talking about earlier, can come from within the tradition, use it properly, it's superb. But when it comes from within the tradition and doesn't use it properly, or is some falters, or it can be very constricting. And as we know, it's about it, and we know that.
Well, yeah, I know it's something that you've always complained about, because the bardic compositions of the 12th to the 16th or 17th centuries tend to be extremely long. Some of them are more than 100 verses, and they're written in very formal kind of language and stereotype language, and some poets will just drone on and on and on and on and on, praising their lord, which is what they have to do. If you've got, Henry VIII or Elizabeth breathing down your neck, you're going to be doing your level best to praise them as much as you can. It's the same kind of idea, but we get a lot of a lot of the bardic poetry of that era is dreary and dull, certainly to our modern ears, and we can't pick out the subtleties of the sound the way they could. So yes, you're right. Of course, it's not all as beautiful as this example. I was being a salesman there with that example. Yeah.
Okay, I'm very sorry for the remaining questions. We're going to have to
That's
move
grand.
on. I'm very sorry. Everyone,
Thank you.
join me in thanking Emma again. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to invite our next speaker, Dr. Liz Quirke. Dr. Liz Quirke is a poet and scholar from Kerry with 2 collections from Salmon Poetry, The Road, Slowly in 2018, and How We Arrive in Winter in 2021. Her 3rd collection, tentatively titled Halfway Home, is due to be published in spring 2026. Quirke's poems have been described in the Irish Times as hard-won poems that rise out of a larger silence, redoing the lyrics of Mora. Okay, Mora. And Evan Boland. I'm really sorry, everyone. And Evan Boland for 21st Century Ireland. And How We Arrive in Winter, a best poetry collection of 2021 choice by the Irish Times, has been described as brilliant and deeply moving, and an affecting and assured book, written from the front lines of mourning, but attuned too to the possibility of a future, as in the promise of sweetbread, which ends with the epiphany that there never has been such a call for light as this. And today, Liz will be talking about Tom Gunn, queer poetry, and rhyme as a site of propulsive embodiment. Please join me in welcoming Liz.
Yeah, you don't need to screen share because it's literally just photographs of Tom Gunn.
Okay, well, maybe
it's either me or photographs of Tom Gunn, so go for Tom Gunn, actually.
Okay. There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm not the best PowerPointer, so I literally just stick photographs up and go through them to fulfill the audio-visual component of a paper. So maybe they're not even going to come up. Maybe they never will. But I know they existed at one point. Might do an escape.
Picture can't be displayed. Oh,
Picture can't be displayed. Oh well.
Oh dear. Let me try.
Well, he looked like, if we can get one picture of him, I'll just leave that one
Okay,
there.
I'm so sorry about this.
It's okay. I'll just Google Tom Gunn and throw a picture of him up. Yeah. There we go. That'll do the trick.
There we go.
Here's some books. He was a poet. He wrote some books. Okay, so hello. So good afternoon to everybody. Thanks to George for organising, to Castellac for hosting it, to the Centre of Dante Studies, which I have absolutely nothing to do with. I feel a little bit like the Emperor with no clothes after those first 2 papers, because this is not going to have diphthongs or anything in it. I'm neither a translator or someone that writes in a second language. I write in bog standard common or garden English for my sins. So what I'm going to do today particularly is to speak in my capacity as a practitioner of poetry, and as someone who has skin in a particular game, as a card-carrying queer who writes out of my own lived experience, just to see if exploring the formal aspects of one of my recent obsessions can clarify my thinking around form and function as I move towards completing my 3rd collection. As well as a bit of kite flying on poetics and rhyme and a couple of deep dives into poetry, this paper is going to explore ideas around the work of one particular queer British poet or gay English poet, depending on your denomination, whatever you're having yourself, Tom Gunn, who lived on this planet between the years 1929 and 2004. An obsession of mine, as I said, this occasion's been an invitation to explore ideas around form and function, helping me as a queer poet to understand that there is no one way to write queerness. But for the purposes of this colloquium, I'll be covering a couple of things. Who was Tom Gunn, for those of you who don't know? Why is he important to today's discussion on rhyme? And what can we learn from his poetry that will tell us a little bit more about queer poetics as a field? So to that end, I'm going to give a little bit of contextual biography to establish our boy, and then go into a brief discussion on a couple of Gunn poems. One about is a kind of an elegy, and the other one is a poem. They're both laments, but in different ways. One's about death and one's about taking drugs. I just want to see if the controlled rhyming aspects of Gunn's poem can stand as examples of both the pitfalls and the powers of adhering to metrical procedure. So who was Tom Gunn? Do you all know? Have you heard of Tom Gunn? Yeah, cool. I could cut this page out of the paper then. But for pig iron, because it's typed up, I'll go for it. William Gwynedd Gunn, better known as Tom, was an English poet who spent the better half of his life living, working, and writing in and around San Francisco and the Berkeley area of the United States. To go back to his early beginnings, the young Tom, along with his younger brother Ander, had a peripatetic childhood, largely determined by his father's occupation as a newspaperman. His father, Bert, was career-driven and achieved his dreams of flying high on Fleet Street after making a start as a cub reporter with that giant masthead, the Kent Messenger, later rising to the position of news editor for London's popular Evening Standard at the beginning of the 1930s. This position led to a change in the fortunes of the Gunn family and precipitated their move from humble surroundings to the prestige of an address within the postcode area of Kensington. Not that Bert spent much time at the address, preferring instead to spend time in the pressure cooker of a newsroom close to deadline and with the company of women to whom he was not married. Despite new attempts at relationship for both Bert and Tom's mother, Charlotte, and Charlotte possessing a love for literature and a sometimes questionable intimacy with her son, particularly Tom. She had two sons, Tom and Ander. Tom particularly filled an empty space in her bed, which is a bit odd, and from whom she sought companionship above the duties of an eldest son. Tom's mother, Charlotte, she did struggle in general towards the end of her life and was deeply unhappy, either due to potential unrealized or the residue of trauma and mental strain. Tom was 15 when he found his mother's body lying on the floor of their Kensington home, and this loss rippled out into Gunn's life and poetry in ways too various to mention in this paper. Scholar Michael Knott, formerly of this parish as a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of English, in his excellent biography, Tom Gunn, A Cool Queer Life, it's at the back there, you can see a forehead. That's a part of the book. It paints a very realistic picture, a very detailed picture of Gunn's parents' marriage, noting that the couple were fundamentally temperamentally unsuited, which is a very generous depiction. Charlotte, however, was in possession of a rich interior life and saw her husband's infidelities as permission for her too to engage in sexual and romantic life outside of the house. And this upbringing will become relevant and becomes quite relevant within Tom Gunn's life and his poetry. The most important thing to note about this, to use the famous rhyming quatrain by Philip Larkin, is that the trials of Charlotte and Bert had their effect. As Larkin wrote, they fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. Truly, both of Gunn's parents would model ideas around coupledom, of relationships between people, the echoes of which can be seen in Gunn's own partnership with Mike Carthaigh. There he is there. I think Mike is the guy lying down in 1967, where they don't wear shorts. They just go full jeans and a hat to the beach. Lament, one of the poems that I'll mention today, is a direct result of that upbringing. As the subject of that poem, Alan Noteworthy is one of Gunn's many special friends that he had over the years, a man with whom Tom was not in love, as he wrote to his friend Tony White, but one whom he loved a lot. So there are distinctions always to be made, and there are kind of these split ideas around love and loving and how to be loved. The idea that the couplet is inarguable, but the idea of the permanently avowed couple is open to revision. So where he was adhering to this idea of this kind of doubling as an important kind of part of the construction of his writing, it didn't really work that way in his personal life. Before we move on to the subject of the lament and Tom's young, pure of heart softy, Alan Noteworthy, and his illness and death, I want to consider the ways in which poetry sank its teeth into Gunn, and where his penchant for rhyming began and why it might have prevailed as a guiding poetic choice for the duration of his writing life. In the same way that his parents projected an external propriety, Gunn's poetry would have that upper middle class bearing of formality and tradition, aspects that belied the truth beneath the language. As many poets do, Tom had a bookish childhood, introduced to the bookshops of Kensington and the verses and nursery rhymes of Robert Louis Stevenson and Beatrix Potter by his mother. Tom found security and a sense of equilibrium between the pages as he turned them with his eager young fingers. An example of T.S. Eliot's point that poetry can communicate before it is understood, the substance of which an older Gunn would understand all too well is Gunn's early love for Beatrix Potter and her gilded warnings. Here are a few lines from one of Potter's cautionary tales. This one is concerned with alcohol consumption and the vicissitudes of men, with a metre akin to the lullabies that Paul Muldoon writes about in his essay, The Point of Poetry, and I did mention Muldoon just because of Ellen. Cecily Parsley lived in a pen and brewed good ale for gentlemen. Gentlemen came every day till Cecily Parsley ran away. Though rudimentary in their bearing, those early rhymes, fables, and warnings can be viewed as eerie foreshadowing of the real and poetic lives that Gunn would go on to lead. Was there ever an inkling for the young poet as he sounded out those words, putting breath behind the syllables, searching for echoes and connections that his own life would be the subject to such considerations? Possibly. It's clear from work that I'll talk about in a minute that some connections did linger. At his co-ed grammar school, Gunn experienced the great formative experience of being shown a new way of thinking by an English teacher who taught him from a book called The Poet's Tongue, an anthology compiled by Auden and John Garrett, showing Gunn that poetry could be anything: a counting out game, a mnemotic for learning Latin verbs, a speech from Shakespeare, etc., etc. And so Gunn set out to explore those possibilities, but from a strangely traditional standpoint for a man who lived and loved as he did. I'll change the picture again just for the crack. There we go. I love how Tom Gunn just puts on more clothes as he gets older and Mike strips off. In contemporary poetry, and by that today, normally I mean for me contemporary poetry starts in 1970, but for today we're starting at the end of World War II. And particularly in gay, lesbian, or queer poetry, we all know that taste and fashions have dictated a turn away from rhyme, a poetic custom moving on from the modes of exemplars such as Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon is an interesting precursor to Gunn in the way that he used rhyme to excavate some essential truth about the brutality and horror of the trenches, in opposition to the more loose-lipped and leery work of poets that came later, like Frank O'Hara, the latter preferring to ignore the larger questions about good and evil and the nature of man, and turning instead to the quotidian, using the ordinary dailiness of common vernacular to depict life as he lived it, exactly down to his obsession with and complaining about really bad coffee. And can we say that either man is wrong? What would Sassoon's poems read like without the sure hand of regular metre to corral his rage, his shock, his disgust? Consider the first 4 lines of Sassoon's poem How to Die, and ask yourself what those lines would transform into without the rigorous control of the metre and rhyme. Dark clouds are smouldering into red, while down the craters morning burns. The dying soldier shifts his head to watch the glory that returns. In terms of rhyme and reason, with regard to queerness, it can be asserted that the more conservative and difficult world presented itself for gay people, the more gay poets opted to eschew any control measures for their self-expression. And I'm including poets like Frank O'Hara here, John Ashbery, later Adrian Rich, Minnie Bruce Pratt, and others, some of whom explored the dailiness of gay and lesbian life, the intimate side of sexuality in ways that were often unvarnished. The general reason lurking behind the poetry of gay writers being self-expression and the assertion of a true and realized self. Gunn's adoration for poetry, his wide reading, and his young attempts at poetry came into the world alongside his adolescence, when he fell in and out of understanding of his body, his sexuality, and his subjects. Besides his mother, some of Gunn's earliest relationships were with poets long dead but ever present, Keats in particular, and the poets and playwrights of Greek myth, poetry, and tragedy, work that was rife in metaphor, that had a layer of meaning above and below what the eye could see. Such hallmarks can be seen in poems of Gunn's, particularly collections like Molly, sometimes pronounced Molly, and its titular poem where he interrogated those epic concerns of fate, inevitability, and matters arising from the constituency of fleshly interactions, and his absolute delight in taking as many hallucinogenic drugs as he could get his hands on. The first 2 lines of the title poem read, Nightmare of beasthood. I'm actually going to read the whole poem in a minute, so let me open it up here. Nightmare of beasthood, snorting, how to wake. I woke, what beasthood skin she made me take. The she here isn't some Aphrodite. This isn't some Queen Mab arrived in the night to distort and upend. It's Molly, it's Molly, it's good old-fashioned ecstasy, rapturous, taken in the sweat of a leather bar in San Francisco. But Gunn uses the rhyming couplet, as the great poet Taylor Swift once said, as the drug itself, to look what you made me do. His behavior is not his own. His beasthood, twice mentioned, is not his fault. The rest of the poem reads, leathery toad that ruts for days on end, or cringing, dribbling dog, man's servile friend, or cat that prettily pounces on its meat, tortures its hours, then does not care to eat. Parrot, moth, shark, wolf, crocodile, ass, flea, what germs, what jostling mobs there were in me. Later, he has a doubling effect when in lines towards the kind of final third of the poem, he writes about the pale lashed eyes being his only human feature. My teeth tear, or tear, depending on what declension of the word that you want to use. Gunn, in this particular poem, or Gunn's speaker, is the snouted creature. Let's turn the old page. And I might change the picture as well. There we go. See, it's all coming together, doesn't it? It's how the magic happens. It's very slick. In Molly, and subsequent poems, Gunn's life in San Francisco, his social self, his sexual dalliances, his affairs, his experiences with hallucinogenic drug taking seem to be meted out through control, so as to seem slightly detached from the poet himself, slightly depersonalized, distant from the sober poet, the university professor of the daytime, the mirror self who speaks in iambic pentameter, the rhythms of most of our first poetic encounters. And in this mode, he wasn't just separate from other queer poets, he also stood out from the crowd of his peers, which in the 60s included Robert Lowell, John Berryman, Anne Sexton, Ted Hughes, and Sylvia Plath. This is a fun part about Tom Gunn's personality. An Englishman in America, Gunn abhorred the confessional nature of Plath. He was allergic to her. An American transplanted to England, he loathed her confessional nature, how openly she wore her vagaries, her troubles, her psychic tumult, the way she doled out the pities and rages of her life and her work. Despite being guilty of the same impulses, Gunn's antipathy towards Plath points towards a desire by the former to obscure some of his more disruptive and errant tendencies. He wanted a little freedom, but constructed a lot of mystery. Rather than burning down the world and eating men like air like Sylvia, Gunn instead kept his powder dry. During this era, Gunn was published alongside Ted Hughes in one of the strangest two-headed Faber publications ever to make landfall. And out of the two, Gunn seemed more inaccessible, seeming, as Clive Wilmer writes in the introduction to the selected poems, that some readers of the selection found Gunn difficult, intellectual, too strictly formal, even cold. And that despite Gunn's obsession with leather boys, biker gangs, rock and roll, and the nightlife of sprawling American cities, he did not expose an inner self at all, anywhere to be found in the poetry. This can be taken in a number of ways. One idea being that Gunn was just too British to write about his sexual and social life as he lived it, preferring to choose the lyrical anonymity of Elizabethan poets like Thomas Campion, whose poem I Care Not for These Ladies could stand as a roadmap for the metrical, providing an example of how to control his language and how to marry that language with the musicality of formal meter in a way that mutes desire. Let me now focus on lament. You'll see there on that really well put together slide, one of the first written versions of it, one of the draft versions that are found in his papers. This is one of the cornerstones of a collection called The Man with Night Sweats, a 1992 Faber collection that came as a publication after a 10-year break. So for me, it seems like it arrives like a kind of a shell out of a cannon into the world at the time. Responsive, articulate, very, very clear. It contains a suite of poems towards the end of the collection in response to the AIDS crisis and in response to the death of friends and lovers of Gunn's. For me, as a poet who has written about grief and queerness in a personal sense, Lament stands as one of Gunn's most moving poems, and as a lesson in elegy and how to propel a poetic narrative over ground that the poet would much rather not travel. As poets, we can find all sorts of ways to disturb our progress on subjects that hold the capacity to injure us. And we see those sorts of metaphorical gymnastics in the poems in the collection Molly from 1971, the title poem of which I just mentioned. Let me read a little of Lament for you now, so that we can all move into the last part of the paper together. So addressing Alan Noseworthy, the beautiful young man with no t-shirt on the slide, Lament opens thus. Your dying was a difficult enterprise. First, petty things took up your energies, the small but clustering duties of the sick, irritant as the cough's dry rhetoric. Those hours of waiting for pills, shot, x-ray, or test, while you read 2 novels a day, already with a kind of clumsy stealth distance you from the habits of your health. In hope still, courteous still, but tired and thin, you tried to stay the man that you had been, treating each symptom as a mere mishap without import. But then the spinal tap. It brought a hard headache. And when night came, I heard you wake up from the same bad dream every half hour with the same short cry of mild outrage before immediately slipping into the nightmare once again, empty of content, but the drip of pain. We see in there that there are some places where there's a little bit of off-rhyme creeping in, but generally throughout Lament, there is no sleight of hand. There's no linguistic acrobatics, only inevitable and controlled marching at a funeral pace towards the death of his friend that was absolutely unavoidable. In Lament, Gunn's variations are modelled in the prosody, in his punctuation, in the slight moments where lines are disturbed, but time and again we return to the sure scaffolding of the rhyme, the vertebrae from which all the details of the event can hang. A poem of its time in one way, Lament in its metre echoes a world rife with AIDS panic, the gay community losing its men by the hundreds, the little indignities of those particular deaths, and the ways in which the queer body became a war zone, a site of attrition and decay. It's interesting that Gunn uses the lyric mode, the formality of the Chaucer favourite, the heroic couplet, those 2 lines of iambic pentameter that Don Patterson refers to as the AS matrix, trying to make iambic pentameter sexy, the alternate stress matrix. The critic David Kaplan refers to Lament's form, the heroic couplet, as the ugly stepsister, ignored by suitors who rushed to her more attractive companions, the villanelle, the pantoum, the sestina, although I have my doubts about the attraction of the sestina. Preferring this outwardly simplistic mode of rhyme and metre to document in a realistic way, the last innings for his friend and former lover. In Dustin Stewart's article, Coupling Men in the Couplet Space, Pope to Gunn, he writes of Gunn's belief that traditional canonical technique can enhance improvisatory and up-to-date subject matter, taking Christopher Marlowe and Walt Whitman as his gay forefathers. I was going to put them as gay foremothers, but then I thought that'd be a little off base. Gunn felt he possessed a blueprint whereupon formal control could then serve as both a defining part of the exploration, an order within freedom, and a device for assessing it, as though from the outside. To move towards a conclusion, it's clear that throughout his work, and referring at this point, particularly for today's purpose, the work to be found in Molly and in The Man with Night Sweats, that Gunn utilizes rhyme and meter and all of the formal implements in the toolbox of poetry as techniques to assert authority, as incantations, as ways to control our transit through and across the undulating topography of a queer life in the 20th century. As you heard moments ago in those opening lines to Lament, Gunn's language about the difficult enterprise of the death of his beloved friend is restrained. It's challenging the violent nature of death by AIDS, the rhyme providing a propulsive force that helps to guide us through and countermands the vitriol and homophobia of the time. In this mode, he presents his friend as human, possessing courteousness, being able in one parenthetical moment to claim that he read 2 novels a day, the most human aspect of everything. Though utilizing the lyric form and poetic conventions around rhyme and the heroic couplet, Gunn delivers us, alongside him, the poet, back into time again, truly changed and with us into a world so changed by the subjects and substances of his poetry. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. That was
So-
absolutely fantastic and so beautifully written and presented. I'm speechless.
No questions now.
We'll have a couple of questions. Sorry. Any questions? Yes, Jason.
Thank you for that really impressive overview as well. Despite yourself deprecating Can I bring you to another gay Englishman? Like
Always.
In America, who likes to dress up in traditional person. Is he an influence? Is he someone you project? Is it? I mean,
There's an awareness there, and there feels like sometimes I didn't go into any of the sort of educational stuff. I was saying it to Lee just before we came up, but they're like he's coming from Cambridge to Stanford to teaching at Berkeley, so he's very aware of the academy and his place within it, and he's aware as well of those who stand as kind of pillars of poetry, and I think that's part of and. Forgive me for beating the drum over and over again, but I think his adherence to traditional form in that way is a kind of a sign for me that he wants to play with the big boys. You know what I mean? He doesn't want to be differentiated from poets or male poets or the poets that kind of are the tastemakers of poetry in the 20th century. He doesn't want his sexuality, his behavior, his lifestyle to separate him in any way. So I think it's key. I think there's an awareness there, and the reasons that he's using such formalism is to be part of the gang, I believe. So I'll let you know if I'm wrong. Yeah.
Because they were exact contemporaries at Cambridge, and they were both mentored, if you like, by Liz Hospital, the poetry group, along with the Barbados poet Bradley, interesting, was still in that year at Cambridge.
Yeah.
That may be why
Coterie dynamics don't always work out. And that book is particularly strange. It's a very strange book because it kind of sets them side by side as, I don't know, like say now you pick up that book as a young poet or a scholar or something, you see the two then as being presented as equal and the same because they're in this volume. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think there's one of the reasons that Gunn left England was to escape that sort of Cambridge dynamic that he was trapped in. But then he also kept going back to England because it was part of his DNA and his bone marrow. You know what I mean? But yeah, very, very. What I love about Gunn is that in his conversations with friends and in his letters and stuff, it's like the equivalent to our modern day WhatsApp groups between writers. Like he bitches wholesale in his about everyone he disagrees with, about every opinion that he's ever had about any poem, any poet in the world, and it's lovely to read because they're written out as long letters, not just like short text that you can throw off in a lift, you know. But yeah, the Cambridge thing is very much something that hangs over him and that he has to stand for, I think. I'll do the job. Hello, John.
Okay, well, I'll take one more, shall we then? And then, yeah, okay, go.
I remember we looked at the lines of one of your classes, and really stuck out to me there was the way the rhyme like seemed to like I was picturing it as a sort of really finality of death, and I didn't realize that it was like so common in the rest of his poems as well. Do you think that like it's something, as you said, where it's like trying to like play with the big boys, or is it like something that serves a purpose as rhetorical throughout his poetry?
Yeah, like I think the way that it works in lament is that the rhyme is often interior to the unit of the sentence at a sentence level. So you're traveling over the rhyme at the end of the line. And I mean, it's an effect, it's a conceit, it's a way of cohering things, it's a way of kind of keeping the thoughts together, as it were. To go back to Paul Muldoon for Ellen, like it's the same way that Paul Muldoon has his exploded sestinas, and he has those kind of like to write in cantata. He exploded the sequence of sestinas called the Yarrow, and then has words every so often as touchstones or points that he wanted to get to. Like you can read lament as like it's a very long kind of gathered together coherent lyric, but in the punctuation, like there's little signs that we should pick this thing apart. Like there's a tiny indentation in places where the rhyme is, the way that like the phrase units that are used, the kind of the differentiation between how he tells each part of the story, the way he moves from sort of dispassionate witness to sort of broken-hearted participant in this kind of death. There's moments of like, you know, I love a good parenthesis. You know, there's two parenthetical moments in Lament that I think they might be the places that the rhyme is helping him get to. So they're kind of the rhymes in this. You're saying ringing, I'm saying swinging from branches at this point. But yeah, that's my 2 cents anyway.
Thank you so much, Liz. And please join me in thanking her again. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. Just going to introduce our next speaker, who is George. So George Rayson is an IRC or Research Ireland postdoctoral fellow here at UCC. He completed his PhD in 2024 at the University of Cambridge with a thesis entitled Dante's Hapax Legomena in the Commedia, a study of poetic singularity. Hardly trips off the tongue, but it's a very, very good work, I can assure you, and soon, hopefully, to be in print. Prior to his PhD, he did a BA in English at the University of York in 2018 before completing an MPhil when he moved to Cambridge in European, Latin American, and comparative literature and cultures. The title of his paper today is Reams of Rhymes, Race and Rhyme, and the Material Text in Medieval Italy. George, a te la parola.
Thank you. Grazie mille, Dara. I'm gonna get right into it because without much preamble, because nobody really wants to hear more about Dante than they have to. For God's sake, I'm gonna have to do the same thing again. Eccoci qua. Okay, so this paper will predominantly focus on a particularly interesting word and its variants, the word risma, used by Dante and other medieval Italian poets, that appears to provide a tantalizing connection to the word rhyme. I want to first explore the history of the word's use in medieval Italian vernacular poetry before examining how the word can provide an aperture into Dante's thinking about rhyme, how rhyme can elucidate certain theoretical and indeed political concerns. So, the paper will be focused primarily on Dante and in particular Inferno 28. In this canto, the mutilation of the sowers of discord, including the prophet Muhammad, comprises probably the most notorious example of Dante's treatment of the other in the Commedia. The prophet is punished here for having caused the schism of Islam away from Christianity, a relatively recent event in Dante's time. I'm going to move on from this particular, this is the passage where Muhammad introduces himself, to focus on one particularly germane section, one particular trio of rhymes, these isma rhymes, schisma, nachisma, risma. And these are one of the two rhymes in this passage of Muhammad's speech, whose only occurrence in the Commedia is here. So Dante doesn't use the rhyme isma anywhere else in the poem, and he doesn't use the rhyme uja, pertuja, tranguja, minuja, at any other point either. So here Muhammad is explaining that the souls were sowers of scandal and schism when living, and so they are maimed as they are. He says that a devil is behind him who cuts achisma so cruelly, putting each of this group of souls, risma, which is in fact a cognate of ream, as in a ream of paper, to the sword, when they have traced the path of the pocket, the bolger that they're in. These rhymes are all hapax, used only once in the poem. So they can constitute, we have a New Testament word, schisma, an old French word from achosmer, achisma, and an Arabic word, risma, from al-risma, whose cognates entered Romance languages through Islamic imports of paper into Europe via Spain. This risma is the word I would like to focus on, because not only is there a cognate to the word ream, of paper, and therefore a fascinating potential metatext which relates to the processes of material composition, but, as we shall see, an even more enticing potential link to the word rhyme. Carla Mayet argues for this Arabic etymology to be foregrounded in interpreting the word, especially given its speaker. Mayet says that the original al-rizma, and I quote, referred not to bundles of finished paper, but rather to bundles of rag cloth of the sort that were slashed and pulped in the process of paper making, rather than the souls approaching their punishment, and I quote again, in an orderly array like a ream of paper bundled for sale. The repeated thrashing of bundles of cloth with blades and nails more closely matches the punishment meted in the ninth bulger than the image of fresh paper, tidily bounded, bundled for market. Mayet's argument is compelling because it entails lexical mimesis of both the linguistic origin of the speaker and the nature of the punishment, a kind of etymological contrapasso. This is the word where the hapax, this is the canto where the hapax contrapasso is used. It's the lex talionis, the ethical system by which inferno is run, an eye for an eye, or a punishment fitting the crime. So where we have an Arabic word used by an Arabic speaker as both a marker of his act of religious schism and a more accurate representation of his punishment. Both crime and punishment are bundled into one word. Mayet says that risma is the first recorded use of the word in Italian, and I'm going to explore that claim a little bit now. This view does not seem to be supported by Riccardo Viel, who does not include the word in his index of prime attestazioni in the Commedia. That's words whose first recorded use in Italian comes in the Commedia. A glance at the Corpus Ovi, which is a database of all medieval Italian texts, it's searchable by individual word, which is great. So a glance at the database for rism, with a question mark, which you can do because I wanted to make sure that there was no, because of the gender there, because Italian is obviously a very gendered language, so as I think probably everybody here knows. So I just wanted to make sure there was nothing getting through the cracks. So if you search rism, okay, you can see that Jacopone datori, which is the second one down, includes the word risma, risme, feminine ending, like in Dante, risme, but plural. So risma, singular in Dante, risme, plural, feminine ending as well, here. In this lauda, como la vita dell'uomo è penosa. And the poem reads, a quanti male l'uom sottoposto non porriom tosto per risme contare. The feminine plural ending, therefore, would have suggested to Viel that Jacopone had already used the word, whose singular form, Mayet argues, is found for the first time in Dante. But it is clear from an examination of these other words as well that Jacopone is not quite referring to the same thing as Dante. Guido Cavalcanti, Jacopone again, and Catenacci da Anagni all use the masculine-ended rismo or rismi in poetry before Dante. And the examples of Cavalcanti and Jacopone are particularly illustrative. So returning to Jacopone, this time with a louder Frata Ranaldo, dossi andato. The poem reads thus, and Gianfranco Contini, in his edition of the Poeti del Duecento, explains that here rismi means versi, verses, lines, adding that, and I've translated the quote for clarity, that it is the meaning of the medieval, that versi here, or rismi, is the meaning of the medieval Latin rhythmus, as Emma mentioned, from which, through French, we get the word rima into Italian. Although it must be noted that this is not by no means the only reading by editors of this text of Jacopone's of the word. So Favati, in his edition, gives sans arismo, which is then glossed by De Robertis in his commented edition of Favati's work as senza ricorso al numero, ossia al cumulo delle autoritate. So he reads a kind of, it's without recourse to the number or the aggregation of authorities. This kind of rismo is a kind of collection of other written texts. And Claudio Giunta suggests orismo, from the Greek horismos, meaning definition. But Roberto Rea and Giorgio Inglese prefer rismo and state that Giunta's orismo is very rare in Latin and is therefore completely without attestation in the Italian of the period. So although editors have clearly been troubled by the reading of the word, even the Favati reading's reference to number links to Continian rismo's implication of metrical arrangement. The number in question from Favati is also a plethora of written philosophical authorities, and the junta reading of definition permits an association with lexical issues. In sum, all readings of the word by editors hint at a language of textuality. Even before Jacopone, Guido Cavalcanti, in a sonnet sardonically and critically addressed to Guittone d'Arezzo, which criticizes the latter's poetic capabilities, also uses the singular masculine rismo. And Contini here as well glosses rismo as veste poetica, a kind of poetic kind of cloth or habiliment. And as the word again refers to poetic structure. So if the uses of the masculine ended rismo by Cavalcanti and Jacopone amount to the same thing as the feminine ended rima, or at least amounting to a pretty similar thing, then surely in the feminine ending use of risme by Jacopone da Todi, that's also a variant, I would suggest, on rima. And the fluidity of gendered endings appears to have caused Viel to miss an entry in his index, as Jacopone's risme here is not the Arabic-derived risma, but rather a variation on the Latin and French-derived and feminine-ended rima. So I think Dante's risma is a first attestation in the Italian language. If the strict sense of what Dante is referring to with risma differs from his lyric predecessors, there remains a clear echoic and thematic genealogy. Even from Cavalcanti to Jacopone, there is a repetition of 3 of the same ismo rhymes, or ismi rhymes. Solegismo, sophismi, syllogismi, rismi, solegismo, rismo, barbarismo, sophismo. Not only then does rismo refer to poetic structure, but it forms part of a particular rhyming construction passed down between poets. Indeed, Cavalcanti and Jacopone's shared fascination with this rhyme arrangement is noticed and singularly enshrined by Dante again in his Paradiso. Not only are the isma rhymes of Inferno 28 unique in the Commedia, but so are the ismi rhymes at the start of Paradiso 11, and it's the same arrangement: syllogismi, amphorismi, sophismi. And this is Dante's invective against hollow earthly pursuits before the meeting with St. Francis. In the Commedia, amphorismi and sophismi are both hapax, suggesting that even amongst a breathless list of vanities, these words ending in ismi are of singular importance, and rhyme position often lends itself to singular usages. But there is also a thematic significance to these particular words being in such high relief, from Cavalcanti's sardonic address to Guittone, to Jacopone's lauda of Frate Ronaldo, to Dante's narrator's invective against futile human endeavors in Paradiso 11. The concern with the ismi rhymes is the manipulation and then the establishment of normative uses of language. The relevance of these examples to Prophet Muhammad's rhyming depiction in Inferno 28 begins to emerge. Cavalcanti's third ismo rhyme, and the only one missing in Jacopone and in Dante in the Paradiso, is barbarismo, which Contini glosses as a menda formale, a formal flaw. Contini then cites the Ugocione da Pisa, who wrote the very important etymologies, which is extremely important in medieval literature, on the subject of barbarism, who describes it as a fault, who describes a barbarism as a fault that consists in the joining of letters in a syllable or syllables in a word or in their accents. The fault of Guittone, as Contini hints, is in his control of prosody, and in particular, as the quote from Ugocione stresses, the material, oral elements of syllabification and accent. It is Guittone's rhyming crimes that have earned Cavalcanti's censure. The ismi rhymes reveal that there is an element of control in rhyme. These particular rhymes are a monument to securely fastened, harmonious language. Returning to the ismi rhymes in the Commedia, Paradiso 11 is the canto of Francis, who is praised for trying to convert the proud Sultan to Christ. The direct disapprobation shown against amphorismi, which is an Arabic word as well, or it comes from the Arabic title of Hippocrates' textbook, shifts to a more insidious attempt at the totality of religious representation through the soft coercion of conversion. In these lyric examples, the word rismo is used to mean rima in the generic sense of the latter, which is poetry or verse. Although there is a rich and complicated history of this, and the work of Ryan Pepin is particularly excellent on this, and I'm very grateful to him for sharing with me the as yet unpublished work on this, which is how poets refer to themselves and in medieval Italy, how complicated that process is. Rhythma in Inferno 28 is not directly used in this way. And while the gender of the word is troublesome, as you can see in its lyric uses, it is telling that Petrocchi, in his Edizione Nazionale, so the authoritative edition of Dante's Commedia, does not record any variants on rhythma, although one may exist in an extant manuscript. Rhythma, it certainly is in the Commedia, and it's not directly, at least, a variation on rima, but means a bundle of paper and is used to refer to the group of souls. But already, from that, we can see that the word has been selected for metaphoric purposes. This means there are other words that mean group or company that could have been selected by Dante, but were not. There is something particular about the word and its original meaning that is significant for it to have been selected only once by Dante, for the purposes of describing something else, something for which he would have had plenty, and does have plenty, of other signifiers at his disposal. The singularity of the word's application in the text is mirrored by its highly specific referent in medieval Italian, as understood by the early commentators. So Benvenuto da Imola and Francesco da Buti each agree that it's a comment on the word rhythma as a kind of not just a collection of quartos, but kind of with a multiple of 12. That's specific. I mean, they disagree on the number of quartos, Benvenuto giving 24 and Francesco da Buti giving 12, but rhythma has this distinct technical sense of a ream of paper containing a multiple of 12 quartos. And concerns over the material text obtain too in the passages of the lyric poetry in Cavalcanti and Jacopone, with Jacopone describing the carte produced by Frate Ranaldo, and Cavalcanti rather disparagingly referring to Guitone's writing per syllabate carte. Cavalcanti's mocking half-rhyme syllabate carte is a send-up of Guitone's faulty syllabification. It is a parody which dovetails the production of paper with the hollow churning out of syllables. The waste of the material text is brought into conversation with the waste of prosodic technique, particularly syllabification in all its materiality. Even Contini's gloss of rhythmo as veste poetica brings to mind the recycling of clothing that Mayet attributes to paper production. Poetic structuring becomes clothing, clothing is recycled into paper, paper forms the basis for poetic scribbles, which are then thrown away. The ismo-ismi rhymes and their word choices are recycled as well, from Cavalcanti to Jacopone to Dante, and rhythma is repurposed by Dante from its numerically specific original definition to a broader sense of ream, to then refer to a group of souls. Finally, the bodies of the souls in Inferno 28 are wasted in an identityless mutilation, a kind of anonymous production line evocative of the shredding of cloth to make paper. The text of the Commedia invites us to return to the place at which its very material is made. If Inferno 28 suggests we read rima behind rhythma, then it is possible that it is not just in the generic sense of versification, but also in the specific sense of rhyme. There is something about rhyme whose concatenation of words does not require the hand of logic, and is, as Emma has discussed, is subject to its own laws of logic, that is akin to a mechanical production of reams of paper. Adam Pyatt claims polemically against Joyce's Finnegan's Wake that it is constituted by, and I quote, reams of rhymes and their oversimplified reasons. Now I want to think about whether such oversimplified reasons lie behind Dante's rhymes and what that means for the linguistic and political projects of the Commedia. So we have these three rare words in rhyme together across a unique rhyme isma. They're also rare as to be unique, and from one perspective, the connection of these three rare words reveals the inclusive nature of Dante's lexical project. But lexical choice is often a political matter, and the Commedia is, at its most atomic level of organization, an exercise in assimilation, thus a more cynical perspective to that of plurilinguistic harmony, and one that corresponds with the religio-political violence of Inferno 28, is that the stringing together of three hapax in rhyme exposes the fragility of such connection. A connection in rhyme of three decidedly unrelated words from different languages reveals a kind of a forcefulness, an undercurrent of violence, a coercive measure of harmonization to the tune of the Italian vernacular. And through rhythma's status as a hapax, Muhammad's alterity is underlined. The singularity of the word also demands acute readerly work, as we must involve ourselves in its etymological history as an Arabic word, and a word from a particular labouring practice in order to understand it. We don't know immediately what it means. And readers are pulled in to participate in an othering performance too in Inferno 28, ogling at the abject Muhammad, who is singled out for gruesome retributive justice. A readerly vice, which is compared by Heather Webb in her reading of the canto to Laura Mulvey's notion of the film viewer as a voyeur, entertaining a sadistic enjoyment, perhaps while watching, and this is the example that Mulvey gives of a Tarantino film. In the case of a lyric poet's use of rismo, we can identify a solipsistic pleasure in looking under the surface at the material processes of textual production. Such meta/paratextual explorations can obtain too with rismo in Inferno 28, given its highly specific technical etymology. And as Mayet stresses, Dante had a, and I quote, keen interest in the technology and technical terminology of his age, to the detriment of philosophy of anything else, of any kind of questions of the mind. Mayet argues it's all about the hands, it's all about technology. This fascination is connected to the lurid voyeurism invited by the mutilation of Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad, as he is formulated in the Commedia, bespeaks a cultural fascination with what used to be part of the Christian body politic, but has now been removed, as if that body is presented with one of its own organs, a fascination which is passed on then to the poem's readers. The project of plurilinguistic harmonization is in fact deeply connected to a participation in an othering performance, as the fascination of a hapax is the fascination stimulated towards a key component of a plurilinguistic assemblage which accumulates and appropriates the languages of others. A focus on rhyme, furthermore, puts a stress on vocal, oral language. By staging a meeting of different languages in rhyme position, the poem stages an oral dialogue of different voices. The poem is also staging the speech of a particular character, Muhammad, in order to stage this meeting of languages. And if this meeting is tenuous or coercive, then what of the mechanism by which Muhammad condemns himself with a lexical contrapasso in his own language? A focus on rhyme sheds light on Dante's strategies of ventriloquization, which force us to consider that it is not the Prophet Muhammad who speaks in his own language, but an appropriation and assumption of that voice into the poetic macro structure, a structure which at this moment is predicated on anonymous reproduction of reams and reams of paper and reams of rhymes. Risma does not just evoke Muhammad's Islamic identity, it appropriates it to a mechanical production of reams of rhymes. Thank you. And I'm going to take one question. One. So choose wisely. Or none. We can move on. That's great with me. Oh, okay. I might as well. Okay. Anyone got a question? No? Okay. Go on then, Jason.
So why, I understand it's in the context of Muhammad and Arabic word in that context. The other words are self-consciously Greek. Even in the earlier poetry, they're kind of presented as being abstruse learning, attention, and so on. Is it also, has anybody discussed the possibility that Risma means in some spelling of persona of roots?
Oh, wow.
That it's kind of everybody from this stock.
I had not thought about that. That might be worth looking into.
It would be hard to explain why there's a missing note.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. But so not the, because the Greek thing that was posited by Claudio Junta was orismo as definition, but that was not. They didn't really. The other philologists didn't really like that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll look into that because I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't invalidate stuff.
I'm thinking something very basic. My mother used to speak of gente de Quellarisma, which was people of that age.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I hadn't thought of it.
It's sort of like a kind of, not a kind of casual sort of, kind of like a them, not them.
Not people quite like us.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
A little derogatory.
Okay.
Yeah, it just was coming to me really with the question of just this Italian word.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that. Okay. Am I able to move on? Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Oh, yeah, cheers. Okay, we're doing all right. We're doing all right. We've brought it round. Okay, so I'd like to invite our penultimate speaker today. So Martin Veiga is a poet, translator, and senior lecturer in the Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies at University College Cork. He is the director of the Irish Centre for Galician Studies and the co-editor of Galicia 21, Journal of Contemporary Galician Studies. His main research areas are contemporary Galician and Irish poetry, literary translation, creative writing, eco-criticism, and travel and mobility narratives in the Hispanic world, mainly in the Iberian contexts. Recent books include A Different Eden, Eco-Poetry from Ireland and Galicia, Here and Beyond, Narratives of Travel and Mobility in Iberian Culture, Text, Image, Archive, Galician Literature and the Visual Arts, and he has published 6 award-winning poetry collections in Galician. Now, I don't know how to read Galician. I don't want to butcher. I'm not going to butcher the pronunciation of it. He has also published the bilingual Galician English anthology Alfaias na Lama, Poesia Selecta, 1990 to 2020, Jewels in the Mud, Selected Poems, 1990 to 2020. He has translated into Galician poems by E.E. Cummings, Geoffrey Hill, T.E. Hulme, Ezra Pound, and W.B. Yeats, and his most recent published translations include Ferrovias by John Verger and Anne Michaels, Anai Sombra by Sean Virgo, and Cacho Quartetos by T.S. Eliot. And his paper today will be Figures of Order on Leishapren. Have I said that right?
Yeah, perfect.
Leishapren, rhyme, and repetition. Please.
Is that okay the way it is for people online?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So please join me in welcoming Martin.
Thank you very much, George, and thank you for organizing this. When George contacted me to ask me, would you be interested in participating in this? Do you think that rhyme matters? And I said, yes, I think rhyme matters, and I'll be delighted to participate in this. So here we are on a beautiful day, and thank you for all the support, the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland, CASILAC, and all the institutional necessary support for these things to happen. I normally work on contemporary material, but the invitation kind of made me think about medieval stuff. And so I'm going to kind of share a few ideas, a few thoughts about, perhaps not so much about rhyme as about repetition, and then I'll exemplify my thoughts by referring to a cantiga, a medieval Galician Portuguese poem. So I want to talk around rhyme as a trope based on repetition and other forms of parallelism and repetition in poetry, which might not be considered technically as rhyme, but that seek to generate similar or closely related effects on the reader when the reading happens on the page, or on the audience when the poetry is read out loud or performed, which is obviously very important in medieval poetry, as I demonstrated earlier. After some considerations about rhyme, repetition, and form, I will then focus more particularly on leixapren, one of the compositional techniques more typically associated with the tradition of the medieval Galician Portuguese cantigas de amigo, the songs for a friend or friend songs, a collection of secular poems composed in the Iberian Peninsula between the 12th and the 14th, 15th centuries in the Galician Portuguese language. So as a way of, to start the discussion, I should probably say that repetition in poetry does not exist as such, because the effect of something that is read or heard once changes when this is read or heard again. And this has been pointed out by others more eloquently than me before. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that idea of repetition not being an issue in contemporary poetry, which is it's a bit of a provocation, obviously. Glenn Maxwell, his book on poetry, says, regarding repetition, there is none in poetry, or at least what looks like repetition isn't repetition, he says. And to demonstrate this, he provides several examples. I just selected this one, which is by Robert Frost, and says, the woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep.
and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Maxwell argues then that recurrence of words isn't repetition, and that it would not be possible to say this couplet in exactly the same way twice, because what has intervened between the two technically identical lines is, and this is a quote, the need to say the same again. And we could use a lot of examples, like, a lot of examples, for example, Sylvia Plath does this a lot, and so on. I have another argument about the non-existence of repetition as such by an Argentinian poet, Mariano Peiró, who explores the same argument in more detail in relation to a sonnet by Luis de Góngora, the Golden Age Spanish poet. And it's a bit of a long quote, but I think it will be interesting to read it in full. In reality, he says, there is no such thing as repetition. To think otherwise is to fail to understand that the first time something happens is radically different from the second. That the second time, there is also something that happens for the first time. The reappearance of something that was unique before. Perhaps what is preserved from one time to the next is more striking than what varies. Of course, each time something is repeated, while reinforcing and confirming, it moves away from the first time it occurred. The meaning of what is repeated accumulates, disintegrates, deflates, or spreads with each repetition. Each time is unique and different from the others. What I mean by this is that repetition, which in other contexts is a symbol of immobility, here generates movement. I think this idea of repetition as a movement generation tool is very interesting, and I will come back to this in relation to Lexapren, because I think Lexapren in many ways operates in similar terms, not as a generator of immobility, but as a movement propeller, so to speak. But of course, there are many different manifestations of repetition in poetry. Just to name a few: alliteration, anaphora, rhyme, indeed, parallelism, either syntactical or lexical, epanadiplosis. We could go on. The vast array of variations of figures based on repetition confirms the ancient and very profound alliance of poetry and the use of repeated patterns of some sort, whether these patterns are sonic, visual, verbal, structural, etc. Rhyme has also another dimension which may result apparently contradictory, but that shares with other manifestations of form. I think it was Ellen who alluded to this earlier. On the other hand, on the one hand, it limits and restrains. As Eliot has put it, it imposes, this is a quote, it imposes a much severer strain upon the language. But on the other, it has the potential to also open up new expressive possibilities and create unexpected associations, as many critics obviously have explored. But I'm just going to quote Stalworthy in his essay on versification. This is a quote. He says, in particular referring to the functions of rhyme, he says, more than any other, it has been responsible for making poetry memorable. Its function is a good deal more complicated than may at first appear, in that by associating one rhyme word with another, poets may introduce a remote constellation of associations that may confirm, question, or on occasion deny the literal meaning of their words. And I like that expression of the remote constellation of associations, or something that rhyme has the potential to generate. The same, of course, with other instances of repetition used in poetry, such as the choice of particular stanzas and the implications that these choices have in terms of prosody, in terms of the organization of the lines, how the lines get organized from stanza to stanza, the way an anecdote or an argument might be developed as the stanzas progress, etc., etc. One final point I want to mention has to do with the effect of the rejection of rhyme, or the so-called rejection of rhyme in modern poetry. And this is something that going back to Eliot, he discussed in his essay Reflections on vers libre in 1917. So I'm quoting here. When the comforting echo of rhyme is removed, he says, success or failure in the choice of words, in the sentence structure, in the order, is at once more apparent. So we're exposed. In a way, the tension is, I argue, is transferred to the other realms of the compositional process. Eliot argues that this, and these are his words, this liberation from rhyme might be as well a liberation of rhyme. There's a very interesting choice of prepositions there, which could then be applied with greater effect when it is most needed. For instance, and this is Eliot, in passages in an unrhymed poem where rhyme is wanted for some special effect, for a sudden tightening up, for a cumulative insistence, or for an abrupt change of mood. And I think it's very interesting to see how he uses rhyme in precisely this way all throughout the four quartets, which is a book that exhibits great diversity of form and tone, and this practice of using rhyme sporadically operates, I think, to generate great aesthetic effects. And it's also, I think, very interesting to trace this practice in the work of many contemporary poets who don't use, I suppose, rhyme consistently, but only sporadically to create particular effects. I think that is a very interesting way of thinking as well around this. So these are my thoughts around rhyme and repetition. Now I move on to the second part of the paper, in which I explore ideas of repetition by discussing the use of lei s'apprèn in a cantiga de amigo by the Galician troubadour Fernando Schio, who lived at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th, at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th century. We know a total of 9 poems by him of different genres. Doesn't mean that he probably wrote more, but 9 have survived so far. But before discussing the poem, I'm going to provide some context. I don't know how familiar you are with this particular tradition. So just kind of very, for some of you, it might be kind of very general stuff. Apologies for that. I'm talking about secular Galician medieval poetry that lasted from the late 12th century to until 1354, which is the year of the death of Don Pedro, the Count of Barcelos, the last patron of this type of poetry. And historians have established different periods throughout the centuries. We could say that the splendor period is from 250 to 1300, which is the splendor period when active troubadour poetry is supported and encouraged by royal courts of Alfonso X, Sancho IV of Castile, Alfonso III, and Don Denis of Portugal. Yeah? And then 50 years later, the decadence of this type of material started to develop in the peninsula. I had a bit of material here that I'm not going to discuss about the type of poets, as Emma also talked about the bards and the different types of poets. But basically, the main difference in the Galician Portuguese tradition is the differentiation between the troubadour and the minstrel. Yeah? The troubadour being typically the composer of their own work, and the minstrel being a performer. Yeah? Unlike the Provençal tradition, the Galician troubadours are not necessarily of a noble origin. They could be of different kind of social structures. And what I suppose distinguishes them is authorship, more so than performance. The cantigas were composed all over the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, except Catalonia, the Kingdom of Aragon. They had their own tradition there. And the Galician Portuguese language became a sort of lyrical coin during those years. As you can see there, 1700 secular poems remain. and around 420 religious poems. The Cantigas de Santa Maria, the poems to Our Lady, these have been preserved with music, which is very important. You can see also the three main secular genres, and then there are many subgenres of this to them. The Cantiga de Amor, which is typically associated with the Provençal tradition. The Cantiga de Amigo, which is vernacular, specifically developed in the Galician Portuguese context, and then spread to the whole of Spain. And finally, the satirical songs of mockery and vilification, Descarnio and Maldicer. The Cantiga de Amor is a male voice. The Cantiga de Amigo is a female voice. I think this is a really crucial distinction. Now, unlike the Provençal tradition, where there is a very clear, very well studied number of women troubadours, of troubadours, there is no evidence of such thing in the Galician Portuguese tradition. So all the compositions that we know are the evidence that we have is that they were written by men. But the Cantiga de Amigo is written in the voice of a woman. Yeah? I think that is really crucial here. Now, also very important is the transmission of this kind of material. It's important to note that it was composed for performance only, which means that it wasn't written down. So that's why most of the music has not been preserved, because the copists transcribed the text, but not the music on the cancioneros when they were copying the material. So the only musical notation left of Cantigas de Amigo is the Bindel parchment, which contains the text and the music of 7 poems by Martin Codax, and it's a document of paramount importance that has allowed for the restoration of the musical elements of the tradition. So this musical notation is the only music we have related to Cantigas de Amigo. There's another very important parchment, the Scharer parchment, with also 7 poems, 7 of the love poems, including music as well, by Don Denise. So those are the real jewels of the crown, if you like, because they have allowed us to reconstruct a great deal of the musical tradition. The poems that have survived, as you can see, were copied onto manuscripts at different stages and kept in 3 main cancioneiros or songbooks. The first one is the Cancioneiro da Ajuda, which is a smaller one in number of compositions than the other 2, and is in the Palacio da Ajuda in Lisbon. And the other 2, which are the really more complete ones, are the one in the Biblioteca Vaticana and the Cancionero de Biblioteca Nacional de Lisboa. Yeah? Now, these are related manuscripts, and so I mean, scholars have read them in parallel because they are considered either sisters, as in sister manuscripts, or cousins. Although the copists were different, and there are very apparent differences, even by looking at them, as you can see here. They were copied from an earlier manuscript or manuscripts in the 16th century at the behest of the Italian humanist Angelo Collodi, and that's why they are in Italy. Yeah? Now, these are the two manuscript versions of the Cantiga that I'm going to discuss. It's highlighted in kind of whiter color, and the one on the left is the Biblioteca Nacional, and the 2 on the right is the Biblioteca Vaticana. Now, the French song, the song of a woman in love, as I say, is a poem in the voice of a woman who expresses joy or sadness about her lover. The word amigo, friend, yeah, or lover, is used to refer to him, and this is a defining feature of the genre. So when we see amigo around a poem, we infer, very typically, that this is a Cantiga de Amigo. And I don't know if you can see, it's quite small, but amigo here is part of the refrain all throughout. The amigo is typically not called directly, rather indirectly through dialogue. And this is an important feature of this type of material. The girl talks to an unknown listener sometimes, to the natural element very often, to God also quite often, to the mother or sister, as it is the case here, or to a friend. Yeah? And there's always kind of interpellations and questioning about what the friend could be and so on. The refrain is a feature of this type of composition and other forms of parallelism, including l'exapreng, which is what I'm going to discuss now. So this is the poem. And even without knowing Galician, I think you'll be able to spot items of features of repetition here. But I'm going to read it. Vayamos, irmana, vayamos dormir, nas ribas do lago, o eu andar vi, a las aves, meu amigo. Vayamos, irmana, vayamos folgar, nas ribas do lago, o eu vi andar, a las aves, meu amigo. E nas ribas do lago, o eu andar vi, seu arco na mano, a las aves ferir, a las aves, meu amigo. E nas ribas do lago, o eu vi andar, seu arco na mano, a las aves tirar, a las aves, meu amigo. Seu arco na mano, a las aves ferir, e las que cantaban, deixalas guarir, a las aves, meu amigo. Seu arco na mano, a las aves tirar, e las que cantaban, non nas quer matar, a las aves, meu amigo. I love this stuff. It's beautiful. Now, the poem displays the typical shape, if you like, or the typical structure of a cantiga de amigo, including, as I said, the mention of the amigo as part of the refrain, and the use of parallelistic structures such as the refrain, indeed, and l'exapreng. So the refrain, as a refrain, is unchanged. It remains the same throughout the entire composition. But the other two lines in each tercet are combined to make the poem progress constantly, moving forwards and backwards. And this is what l'exapreng really means: deixar and prender, to leave and to take. So the poem constantly progresses by leaving and taking, introducing new elements and formulating variations of previous lines that, although fixed patterns of repetition, create a very seductive, a very kind of enclosed atmosphere, which is typical of the genre. But I think it's also clear to see how l'exapreng, by establishing sequences that constantly go backwards and forwards, also suggests an idea of movement, as I suggested earlier, or if you like, of a progression that is interrupted, but it never stops. It always moves, if you like. And Francis Grumer, in his work on the ballads, the popular ballad, this is old material, talked about kind of different structures, different types of ballads, and he referred to a particular type of ballad that develops through what he calls incremental repetition. And I like that term applied here, because I think exactly what's happening. Yeah? There is a repetition, but the poem is growing, or if you like, developing every time, at every line. As it is common in this genre, the lyrical voice is a woman who addresses her sister to propose that they go to sleep, dormir, and to rest, folgar, on the banks of the lake, las ribas do lago, where she knows her friend is hunting birds with his bow. In the final two stanzas, she adds that he does not intend to kill those who sing. This is the poet. The cantiga's location in the natural environment by the water, ideal for amorous encounters in the medieval tradition, and the suggestive sensuality of the imagery, together with the use of the hunting motive, provide the cantiga with several layers of meaning that are at the same time revealed and concealed. Thus, the apparent simplicity of the composition hides a great degree of poetic complexity that resides both in what is said and in what is hinted at, but never directly mentioned. The cantiga has the power to express emotion by displaying great technical awareness, as every cantiga does. A combination that poets everywhere have continued to reconcile or to match through the centuries. Because, and I have a little quote by one of my favorite American poets, Gertrude Schnackenberg, who argues in relation to meter, and she says, meter is pure emotion. Technique for artists is an emotion, a passion. Technique means only the way a thing is done, and the way a thing is done is one of the most passionate preoccupations an artist can have, not separable, despite critical habits of discussion from what is being expressed. Just as a final thought here, and this is for you to kind of, I won't have time to discuss in detail, that's what I'm trying to say. It's these two different versions of the cantiga, of this cantiga, that I'm kind of very cheekily presenting here in front of each other, for you to kind of see how two different translators have approached the translation of this cantiga. The one on the left is by John Rutherford. He's a very eminent scholar and translator. The one on the right is by Piers Hutchinson, who is a very eminent poet and translator. And so I'll give you a minute or 50 seconds to kind of go through it, and then I'll just kind of very briefly summarize to bring this to an end, because I'm aware that we are very late. Now, the translators have approached this task of translating the cantiga very differently. They have, if you like, they have prioritized different things. You can see Rutherford, or well, I don't have the Galician on the screen, so you can't really see. But if you read it carefully, Rutherford is more literal. He maintains the refrain untouched, I think, remains the same all the way. But differently to what the cantiga does, it separates it from the previous lines through punctuation. So if you like, the refrain stands alone, somehow separated from the two previous lines, which is something that, if you can see that, never happens in the Galician. There's always a continuity, so the refrain is integrated as part of the cantiga fully. Yeah? John Rutherford preserves fully, as in to the letter, the use of lexapran, to give a sense, I think, of the compositional tradition of the cantigas from a technical perspective. So if you want to know how lexapran works, you read John Rutherford and you get a very good idea. This is exactly how it works, yeah? From a technical perspective. On the opposite then, Pierce's translation, you can see that it's a freer version, yeah? A freer translation with many variations, including an even use of the lexapran technique. So that kind of parallel progression is not preserved here. And indeed, with differences in the refrain, which are different throughout the entire poem, but if you like, they're better integrated as part of the overall discourse. So this is perhaps the translation of a poet, and perhaps one that approaches the poem and perhaps also the tradition to a contemporary readership. And so I just wanted to highlight how, by translating the poem so differently, the readings also can be so different. And that's all I want to share today. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was absolutely wonderful. I think. Oh, you got yeah. You ain't get away that easily. I think we can all agree that. Well, I mean, I had goose pimples reading that with the reading of the Galician, with the reading of the poem. Absolutely brilliant. Can we have any questions at all in the room, please? Yes.
Hey, Martin, just curious, one day for your own poetry making, when you're digging around these ideas, is there anything particular that you have found that you might to bring up for your own work that you like? Whether the form, sonic element, just anything particular from these cantigas that you brought into your own work? As a curiosity to maybe attempt it, or
Yeah, and not so much the form, but the attention to the language, and it's something that always strikes me, every time I go back to this material. And perhaps more importantly, not so much that, but the importance of technique. And one of the most typical satirical poems of the tradition refers to poets who are careless, who are really kind of lazy, or they're not really. And so technique is really important. I mean, the poem shows that, but it's something that I really learned from that, the importance of it. And then reading stuff in the last few weeks, I remember that thing about Lorca, Garcia Lorca, he says, it's something, it's something, when I think about poetry, it's something that I realize that is more important is, no, si soy poeta es por obra y gracia de la técnica y del esfuerzo. If I'm a poet, it's because of technique and effort. I think this resonates. All that was mentioned earlier also talks. All my life I've been concerned with techniques and nothing else. So that is something that I kind of really learned from these guys. I don't know if I apply it successfully, but it's always a concern. So that is one thing. Then there's another one, which I think is also very important, is that this tradition was not available to the 19th century writers who started writing modern editions, because the modern editions were not published until the 1920s. And so the writers who started writing the English in the 19th century thought they were writing English for the first time. That was kind of a popular language. They didn't know all this stuff, which is our wealth. And when the first critical editions started to be published in Galicia and Portugal, in Spain, from the 1920s and 30s onwards, there was a huge sense of discovery that brought the poets of the time, particularly from 1930 onwards, to rediscover this material and rewrite and back to it. And so the neo-troubadourist tradition started to develop, typically between the 1928 or so and the Civil War. So there's a huge explosion of this kind of writing, because it was like brand new. There's all these guys are writing in our own language in really, really expensive ways. And so the neo-troubadourist material I find fascinating as a response to this, and I'll always go back to that.
Emma? Oh yeah, sorry, Martin. I should have got you to come in front of the camera.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. The protocols.
Is nature an element of the test throughout, or is it like on a prerequisite? They set deeply in nature.
Always.
Yeah.
Nature features very prominently throughout the entire. In a different way to the Provençal tradition, for example. I always remember that essay by Ezra Pound, where he walked in the 1910s around the Languedoc area, just to have a sense of how these guys experienced, what they experienced. And he said, "Oh, I slept rough for weeks, so now I know why all the poems start with reference to the weather." So it's a bit like that.
Okay, if we are okay to finish there, please join me in giving another round of applause to Martin. Absolutely fantastic, thank you. And now I'd like to introduce sadly, our final speaker today. And I've been told in no uncertain terms to keep it very brief. So Corinna Salvadori Lonergan is an Italianist, has spent a lifetime in Trinity College Dublin. She talks and writes happily on Dante, Michelangelo, Yeats, Beckett, and it says here whatever, and whatever. So please join me in welcoming Corinna. You're going to bring the chair. Okay. I think we're good. Okay. All right. Okay. All
Lovely.
right.
Thank you. That's lovely. Well, first, I'm going to begin with a lot of thanks. Thanks to Dara, who first mentioned this, and George, who then wrote, and here I am. And I want to thank all the previous speakers, because it's been absolutely most interesting. you all agreed with me. I can't think of anything that was said that I wasn't in agreement with. I thought it was lovely. And I even got a new suggestion from Martine, because I've always thought of poetry from earliest childhood when I went on and on with the filastrocche. Nursery rhymes. At the asilo, I got punished for not shutting up. My poor mother at times would be exhausted and would go into another room as I chanted the poetry on and on and on. I just have always found poetry, which is really rhyme and rhythm, hypnotic. But seductive, that's the word that I got now. And I thought that's beautiful. I will add it to the repertoire. So thank you very much. And I loved all the theory that we had earlier, because that's all theory that I would be completely in agreement with. And in fact, I called the talk, although it got a little change to Dante, legame mosaico, I called it Rhyme Will Have Rhyme, because I think it's crucial what has been written in the original with a rhythm rhyme that go together. I don't really think you can dismember them. So I know it's not a general point that is accepted. And I was interested even in the mention of Auden at one point today, because I had a review here, which I'll skip, of a translation into Italian of Auden, and the point is made that this is better than any of the others that have ever been rendered into Italian, because his rhyming scheme is respected. And it is stressed that the rhyme in the Auden poems often reverses the whole poem. And if you do not translate the rhyme, you are really losing the essence of what he has written. So now, so we're doing this, and I inevitably will mention Dante and the legame mosaico armonizzata. Why? Because I obviously didn't know Dante when I was 4, 5, 6, when I really got very captured by rhyming verse, doggerel if you want. And it's interesting, when the word poeta came up earlier, Dante calls himself poeta. He distinguishes himself and with the other poets of antiquity. But the usual word was rimatore, just someone who versified and made rhymes. That was the, and you have books like, I think, well, the edition of I rimatori del 200, I rimatori del 300, and so on. But what is poetry for me anyway? It's just music created out of words. And this is what Dante says in this beautiful way, legame mosaico armonizzata. Fair enough, he then adds that you destroy tutta sua dolcezza e armonia if you translate it. In the second book of Convivio, he will add, and again, it's terribly obvious when you think, that poetry has two aspects, bontade and bellezza. The bontade is in what you are saying, the content, and you can convey that in another language. The bellezza is the ornamento, and this is where you need the verbal artistry, the goodness, the beauty, and that is much more difficult to achieve. It's not impossible, but it's certainly more difficult. Now, why do I really believe in this link of rhythm rhyme being the essence of the poem? Because I think the first contact of poetry is very much to the auditory imagination. It's the sound. And when you translate, I have been asked at times, did you have to go for that? I would say yes, because my ultimate decision was the sound. Did it really convince me? And if necessary, I would make a small alteration precisely because of that. And Dara was with me when we were with Benigni in Apiro, and he said, la poesia è nell'orecchio di chi ascolta. The poetry is all in the ear of anybody who is listening. It's in the ear of the listener. And Lewis Carroll, I was given by a colleague, look after the sounds and the sense will take care of itself. All of this is just to say that we need sound above all. So one of my shapers in my whole approach to translation, because I have to say Dante put me off for years, but I am by nature a communicator, a teacher basically. And I remember discussing with Barbara Reynolds what Dante said, don't touch it. And Barbara, I should say, had taken 20 years, but she did translate the whole of the Ariosto's Orlando Furioso into English, and it's good octaves. She rhymes, by the way. You need the rhyme for the octave because they were always on horseback going to the next crossroads and getting deflected into some other adventure. And there's no doubt that her English, like Ariosto's Italian, just gallops along. Not every octave is perfect, but there isn't a perfection in Ariosto either. You know, perfection is something, Castiglione says, it's out there. We all want to reach it, but none of us gets there. So now, Leonardo Bruni, who I believe in his tract, Written Away, 1424, he writes, it's a Latin tract, very direct, simple, De Interpretazione Recta. What he says is the first step when you're wanting to change a text from one language to another, it has to be the interpretation. The interpretatio has to precede, he doesn't quite use the word translation, but the changing of that text into another language. And you see, Barbara Reynolds encouraged me because I believed so greatly in the play that Lorenzo the Magnificent wrote in 1491, just a year before he died. And it's his only work that actually got printed in his lifetime. And she said to me, you must attempt it. You must attempt it. I'll help you, which she did. And although most of the time for every octave, she would send it back to me and say, da capo, just go back, try again, try again. But I did, and I persevered. And then I got the confidence to carry on and do more. Now, Bruni tells you that text is, we know all this, sorry if it's very simplistic, but Bruni says text is polysemous and text is polyphonic. And you have the two live in symbiosis. You have to try and convey both. You have to try and convey. And he speaks of text having the sonus and numerus. In other words, it's the sound of it, and then the rhythm that is in the actual original writing. And that is where you have to work hard at recreating the majestatem, the majesty of the original. Now, well, because I knew Derek Mahon, and as I knew indeed Pierce Hutchinson, and I was thrilled to have Pierce because he really was a poet, and I can see that he would not translate literally but recreate. So thank you for bringing me back to the past, as they have all gone to their reward. And Derek Mahon speaks of rendering in the foreign language as approximating with zest. And that word zest he actually gets from Ted Hughes, who speaks of Ovid, rendering the tales that none original, but Ovid is rewriting and with his own creative zest. And I mentioned Ted Hughes because he has attempted translating Lorenzo the Magnificent, and he has not rhymed. And there is a sonnet of Lorenzo where he really gets the last line magnificently, but it falls flat because the rest of it doesn't really work. Now, what I'm going to concentrate on is Poliziano's Orfeo, with the work that I did of rendering it into English and rhyming it absolutely. I felt it was just essential. Now, what's happened? This doesn't matter. Sorry, this was meant to be a picture of Ghirlandaio. Yeah.
I just reboot it. Is that okay, Corinna?
Yeah, well, it doesn't, yeah.
Yeah, oh, it does. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it was just to give you the only real picture that we have, because Vasari makes up pictures. Lovely. Thank you. Will that be okay for me then?
I think that should be fine.
Yeah, lovely. And that's Poliziano, done by Domenico Ghirlandaio. It's in the Church of Santa Trinita in Florence. And the little boy was actually to become Pope Leo X. He was, in other words, the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. And I'll show you Lorenzo in that same fresco. And they're really the only two genuine portraits we have of them. Others that were done posthumously or enhanced. neither was particularly good looking, so that isn't really relevant. Now, I'm going to begin with we all know the story of Orpheus, so I don't have to give details of the play, and this is the play that eventually becomes Monteverdi in part. It's used as the libretto for Monteverdi's opera. Now, what I want to show you is how rhyme holds together. And the first 6 lines are the part of an octave. It's really 8, right, for the octave. And your octave ends there, but then Poliziano changes to terza rima, and the change, I think, is carried on well by the very fact that he has the rhyme holding it together. Now, the piece is an absolute, the whole of it is a virtuoso piece. You name it, and he shows off what he's able to do. Octaves, he's able to do terza rima. Then we come to sestine. Pace to all those who dislike the sestine that we had mention of, but there will be sestine. And he then has a madrigal as well, and he has a canto carnascialesco. So Poliziano shows his virtuosity, because I can't think of any other word for it, his virtuosity for just doing in verse as close to perfection as he can. And also there is a whole complexity of the rhymes, because he will use a particular rhyme pattern at the beginning. For example, well, when Eurydice is killed first time, then he reuses it, but moving in a backwards manner when she is wrenched back into hell because Orpheus has not obeyed the law that was given to him. So I had to do a great big chart of the rhymes and to make sure that I repeated the rhymes he wanted in the spot that he wanted. It just wasn't easy, but I persevered. My mother used to think I was a dutiful slogger and that I'd get somewhere. Well, I got to the end of this, which was something. So now, also we have the fact that in the second octave, because this is the very beginning, second octave, he has a Slav shepherd speaking, and he talks pidgin Italian. So I did my best to make it pidgin English, if you can say that, right? And then we have the exchange in terza rima. So we'll go through it. Now, I can't be reading them all, but I will just read this anyway for starters. Orpheus' song then won her back from hell, but wretch, he failed to keep the fated law. His wish to look just once he could not quell. His wife then snatched by force was what he saw. So womankind he shunned, and it befell that women's ire unleashed a death most raw. Isolpe peach shushgrit arguri. From up the clouds down here comes Mercury. I'm looking for my calf. You know its hide has got a spot of black, but's mainly white, with russet feet and knee all on one side. Mopsus, dear friend, there's been no calf in flight, not by this fount this morn since I've been here, but sound of lowing I heard beyond that height. Go, Thyrsis, look, you Mopsus, stay and hear what struck me hard, and deep is my lament, for this new fate has robbed me of all cheer. 'Tis but a day when on pursuits intent I saw a nymph by yonder shady cave, fair as to make Diana malcontent. Now, he does go on. Now, George, are we in trouble? No. He goes on, and he goes on and on in the terzine, but then he changes to his lament. And this is where sestine come in. And the sestine have a refrain, as you see, dear woods, to my sweet notes to lend your ear, for she whom I desire just will not hear. And you have those rhyming couplets coming in. Rhyming couplets are quite easy. What's wrong with ottava rima, for example, is that you can do A-B, A-B. That's easy enough. It's to get the third A-B rhyme that's hellish difficult. For me anyway, I'm not very enlightened on the rhymes, but I do my best. So what I want to show you here is that you have to end every sestina with seer, to pick up here and here of the refrain. We'll just look at that beginning there, and then we'll change to another part. So, dear woods, to my sweet notes do lend your ear, for she whom I desire just will not hear. In all her beauty she's deaf to grief, though from my pipe my lamentations pour. My horned cattle stare in disbelief, and in clear water dip their snouts no more. Nor will they gaze, but fresh green grass ignore. Their shepherd's sadness their own life does sear. And then again, lend your ear and hear. Now, what I want to go on to, to show you some of the difficulties that one can have. I'll pass over this, but again, I would have picked up from the Italian the tel at that terzina, sestina, and he brings in tel twice in the next one, and I respected the prosody. I looked at all the repetition, and I had done, as I said, a chart of the rhymes and all of these features, and I just worked on it until I went da capo, until I got there. Now, what I want to show you is how one also has to interpret. And here, my life and my wife is my rendering of vita mia in vita stia, because he has elsewhere called Euridice his wife as well as his life. So it has been vita mia. And I here felt the only way that I could really convey the end of this particular octave was to have life, wife, and taking up the vita, and the verb live. I cannot live now that I've lost my wife in the word life. So I think I respected the original as much as I could, because that was primarily what I needed, I believe, in doing. I'm only a jobber. I'm only a translator. I'm not a poet. I don't recreate. I'm not Kieran Carson, who could say, never mind Montale, I just do it my way. No, that is not me. I felt as a teacher, I owed it to the original to respect it. Now, one difficulty that you have is that 8 lines in Italian can be done as 6 lines in English. So you have occasionally to put in what I call zeppe. You know, you've got to put in padding here and there. Now, how do you pad? Well, the way Leonardo Bruni more or less tells you, you look at your original again and again, you absorb it. He says almost scripturally, totamente, totocore, and whatever. And you have to absorb your original so that when you do fit in bits of your own up to a whole line, you are doing it in keeping with what your original demands. And so here, it's actually not awfully good Poliziano in this dunque piangiamo sconsolata lira, che più non si convien l'usato canto, piangiam, mentre che il ciel nei poli aggira e Filomela cede al nostro pianto. And that poli aggira wasn't really that great, so I just changed it. Let's weep, O sea, O earth, what fate most dire, while sun will rise and set and take no heed, will searing sorrow cause me to expire. And what I really want to say, better than Poliziano and better than myself, is Virgil. That line from the Georgics says it all, with pure words and with perfection. That is one thing I can tell you, having labored on all of this. Poliziano hardly has one stanza of whatever metrical form you want, hardly one that is his own. He draws on the most obscure Greek poets. I had to get huge help from a colleague in Melbourne to help me with all of that. And you are just completely overcome by what he's drawing on and how he's really like the bee that takes and puts together. Now, this here was very tricky. This is the madrigal, and this was also set to music later and so on. Yeah, thank you, George. Thank you. So, right. So now, what was difficult here? All of this is hinging. This is the farewell between Eurydice and Orpheus. And here it is all hinging on the word amore, which rhymes with furore, and in Italian that ore can be languore, terrore, timore. There's endless. What about love in English? Well, there's only one line I made up to console myself. The God of love comes down from above, gives hate a shove, and puts on his glove, because there's nothing else you can rhyme love with, and that's a huge limitation. So after a lot of thinking, I went for what I didn't do. It is the only feminine noun, passion, compassion. Otherwise, I did not have feminine nouns, rhymes at all in this rendering. So that is how I did it. And I did the passion and compassion, and the tolta and tolta, you see in purple in Italian. I did wrenching and wrenching in more or less the same position in all of this. And then the vane and vano in green, I did as useless, useless, again in the same position. And also at the end of the exchange, there is dolor and sorrow, and then Orpheus's octave. This madrigal finishes and he goes back to the octave. Orpheus's octave then has the dolore in the second line, and I brought in the sorrow. So I'll just read you that, and then one more bit, because I know we have to wind up. So, oh, 'twas the unbridled passion that has destroyed us both. They're wrenching me from you without compassion, and useless is our oath. Useless my outstretched arms and anguished cry. Orpheus, I'm seized forevermore. Goodbye. O love, you're wrenched away. Eurydice, do they lack all compassion? O death, O madness, O relentless fate. Unbridled forces moved against our passion. I'll make again my way to plead at Pluto's court, his ire placate. No, stop, don't you dare move. There must you stand. Complaints and wails be only for your ears. Useless your words, your tears, useless your sorrow, as the law must stand. The sentence stands, what can I do but wail, and can it match the sorrow I sustain? I should also say that here, and in Lorenzo's play, the very fact that it's play, it has to be all recited, and you have to do it all out loud. I always do poetry out loud anyway, going back to what we said earlier. It's the sound that hits you and the sound you respond to. And so it's extra difficult, I think, to do dialogue, as I found the poem Ambra of Lorenzo's was, I'll go now to Lorenzo, and this is Lorenzo here, and just give you one example from the play, not to go over time. So there he is in that same Sassetti chapel, and this is Ambra. His poem, it's a 48 octaves in the poem, and I think it's very, very beautiful. It's a metamorphosis. It is, it's a metamorphosis. It's the river Ombrone falling in love with the beautiful nymph Ambra, who is bathing in its waters, and he basically wants to really to rape her, to have her for himself, but she prays to Diana, and she is very slowly and gradually turned into a rock. Now, we can't read it, but it's really beautiful. Now, what I wanted, the reason of this slide now, is to give you the first quotation. I want you to realize also that in Lorenzo, anyway, there is a visual bringing together. And in those two lines, I want you to look at the letter A. Preso il pesce nell'onda dura e chiara, resta come in ambra aurea zanzara. Now, the hell there was, you can't put in a mosquito in English. There was no way. And I owe it to John Woodhouse. We were together in Malta at a conference where we were both bored by the paper, and I began to try and work on this because it took years almost to do. And John was there looking at what I was doing, and he passed me the word gnat, and that's great. And so I got, what fish in strong transparent wave is caught will stay as gnat in golden amber tote. So it's all a lot more visual A's rather than the sound, but you see, that shows you how you can't really recreate the original. Now, this is the beautiful metamorphosis, but I want to show you the lament of Ombrone, because she becomes rock, and basically Ombrone, and there is here, for those of you who know your Dante, the end of Dante's hell. In other words, the frozen lake, the frozen water, because Ombrone's lament, which I find very moving, is with the fact that he has lost what he loved, but he is an immortal God, so there will be no death to release him from his sorrow. And he wants to be congealed, turned to ice, so that forever he will be around the rock of Ambra. Now, I'm going to read 2 octaves, and then we'll read, you will see the third in the next slide, where I have put the French version, because this has been translated into French. It was translated into English at the beginning of the 1800s, 1802, by Susanna Watts, but she Baudelarized it. In other words, she removed all the references to nakedness, and it's full of that. So in removing it all, she's made it a shorter poem, all in rhyming couplets, which is very well written, but I think it loses the point altogether. So I think my own version has been an improvement, but also I want to give you, for those of you who can follow the French, in the next slide, you will see the last stanza in French done by André Chastel, who has done a lot of Lorenzo in French, and indeed was very important academic. So we'll read this and a bit of the next. Alas, in mountains high, whence I descend, live many nymphs, and each is free of care. Fairest was she, my choice can I defend? As a first sign of love, I tore her hair, and such was my behavior in the end. From my cool stream, I drove her to despair. Defenseless, tender, naked, pale, she fled. O'er thorns and stones, her sacred blood she shed. And when I saw her flesh a stone became, I lost forever what was never mine. My cruel desire alone must take the blame. I cannot die, such end would be benign. Immortal God am I. Of woe my flame eternal burns, of deepest love a sign. If death could only come to my release, this great and everlasting grief would cease. I've learned to woo the object of desire, to gain the heart of one I tried to please, to give my love, but only hate acquire. Oh, icy Boreas, my running waters freeze, make hard as rock, so that I may aspire to be beside my nymph and find some ease, and may the hottest sun rays ever felt my rigid crystals ne'er to water melt. Now, if I haven't achieved anything, please read Lorenzo de' Medici. I think as a poet, he was greater than Poliziano. There's much more feeling in Lorenzo. And he was greater than Poliziano. And just because he was so important in a different role altogether, people forget that primarily he was a poet. Here, his play, this poem Ambra, but everywhere. So that is it. I think that is the end, George. And I may have gone over time, but sorry about that. It was lovely to do it. Thank you.
I think we can all agree that we didn't notice even if it did go over time. So thank you. I think it was enrapturing. Does anyone have any questions, please?
No, but when I tried to put this together, I found a number of folders that I have under the heading literary translation. And maybe I still could put my hand on them, but the complexity of it was just beyond all imagination. I don't know how people can do things quickly, and I have felt it almost insulting. Well, an art historian was doing a piece on her art history, and she wrote to me and asked if I would please translate there's a poem of Lorenzo that would have been very appropriate to the piece of Federica, I think it was, that she was writing on. And the publisher was giving me 3 months and he would publish the poem. And I really had to write back and say, there's no way I could have ever done this to a deadline. And in fact, I did take the bit that I knew would be most relevant for her, and I did it. It was all actually in terza rima, and I did it. But really, no, you have to live with it. It has to become part of you. And I really, you know, I really worked very hard on them. But it was a bit, there's a poem by Yeats, The Fascination of What's Difficult, and it grips you and you want. And above all, I think, for example, Ambra is a magnificent poem. I just want other people to read it, you know. And I'm very glad that it's all gone, the book with Ambra and the Rappresentazione. But through an amazing coincidence yesterday, the publisher, who is in Turin, was visiting Dublin with his wife, and I saw them. And I just said, you won't believe it, I don't have even one copy to bring to Cork tomorrow because I've given them all. Well, the last one went to my grandson because he was born and they called him Lorenzo. So I wanted him to have the book with Lorenzo de' Medici on it and his grandmother's name. And Dara, fortunately, has given me a copy of the book, but the publisher is going to do 30 copies for me. He says it hasn't been dismantled yet from whatever you do with printing. And so he's going to send me 30 copies that I can give away. I would have loved to bring them today just to share with you, because I think it's beautiful poetry and you just want to enjoy it.
Are we going to hear some now? When we,
oh yeah, that's right. I'm going to do the lament.
You're going to
and
do
I will
that.
do the Orfeo Eurydice. Those
Beautiful.
two, yeah, that's right. You said with 5 minutes. I have timed them to be 4 minutes, but with a pause, you never know in between. No, well, timing is important. You know, he was one of my students. He knows. He's not here now, but he knows.
That's why he's gone there, because we have, unfortunately, cumulatively, not because of you, run out of time. So could you please join me in thanking all?
Yeah, all of them. They were just great. Yeah, they were great.
Now, we have a poetry reading, so you've not got the last of everybody yet. There's a poetry reading in the staff common room. Does everybody know where that is? Okay, well, if you don't know where it is, can you glom on to somebody who does? And so there's a wine reception there, and we'll all head over there now, if that's okay. Great. There's going to be a noise now when I stop recording. Corinna, there's going to be a noise.